Started with a break. Not a big one, just a short week off work after a long stretch of overtime and back-to-back night shifts. I'd been feeling burned out, mentally and physically, and when a buddy from work told me about a remote cabin he'd used before deep in the northern woods, it felt like exactly what I needed. I wanted to be far away from phones, people, and the city. I left early on a Monday morning in late September. The weather had just started turning. Not cold enough for snow yet, but chilly in the mornings and evenings. I packed warm clothes, a basic first aid kit, canned food, tools, and a shotgun just in case. Not for people, more for any animals that wandered too close. I'd never actually had to use it, but I liked knowing it was there. The drive up took about 7 hours. 5 hours on the highway and 2 on dirt roads that got narrower and rougher the deeper I went. I had to stop twice to clear down branches off the path. My buddy said the cabin was a little over a mile hike from where I'd leave the truck, and he wasn't kidding. It was hidden, no signs, no visible trail, just a faint track through thick trees that twisted downhill before leveling out near a creek. When I finally saw it, I felt something settle in me. It was simple, 1 floor with walls, no paint, and a tin roof. There was a small shed a few feet to the left of the cabin, a fire pit in front, and a stacked pile of firewood under a tarp. No signs of anyone else. No trash. No vandalism. It felt untouched. I checked the lock on the door, which was just a latch and padlock, and opened up. Inside was clean but cold. A small cot, a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves with old supplies. Matches, canned goods, candles, and dusty plates. I dropped my gear, unpacked, and started a fire in the stove. It filled the cabin with dry heat, and the smell of smoke mixing with the old wood and dust made me feel strangely calm. That night, I cooked some beans on the stove, read a little by flashlight, and fell asleep early. No signal, no lights, just dark woods and silence. The second day was easy. I walked along the creek for a bit, just exploring. I didn't see much, just trees, birds, and a few deer tracks. I marked some points with ribbon to make sure I could get back to the cabin without getting turned around. The air was so clean, and I was feeling more relaxed than I had in months. I spent the afternoon splitting firewood and clearing the shed, which was full of old tools, fishing rods, and a rusted axe. The place hadn't been used in years, but everything was still solid. That night, I stayed up a little later. I had a small solar-powered lamp I kept near the bed, and I sat by the table flipping through an old hunting magazine someone had left behind. Around midnight, I heard something move outside, just a crunch, like a step in dry leaves. My body tensed. I waited. Nothing. Probably just a deer or a raccoon. Still, I grabbed the shotgun and quietly stepped to the door. I didn't open it. I just stood there listening. Silence. I put the gun down, turned off the lamp, and crawled into bed. The fire had died down, and the cabin felt colder. It took a long time to fall asleep. By the 3rd day, the quiet was starting to feel heavy. I didn't mind the peace, but there's something about that kind of silence that starts to play with your thoughts. Every small sound outside felt louder. The cabin creaked with the wind. Trees knocked in the distance. Once I swore I heard something splash in the creek. I told myself it was just fish. I spent most of that day reorganizing supplies and cleaning out the shed more. Behind the tools, I found a locked metal box bolted to the floor. The lock was rusted, and I couldn't open it. It made me curious, but I left it alone. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, listening. At one point, I thought I saw movement outside the window. A shape, a shadow, something low to the ground. But when I looked, there was nothing there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I stayed in bed, covers up to my chin, staring at the wall for what felt like hours. The next morning, I stepped outside early. It was cold, and fog hung low around the trees. I walked to the creek, still thinking about the shadow. That's when I noticed something strange. There were tracks by the water, fresh ones, but they weren't from a deer. They were human, barefoot, and they led toward the cabin. My stomach turned. I looked around, trying to spot anyone, but there was nothing but trees. No sound, no movement. I followed the tracks back. They went straight up to the side of the cabin and stopped near the window. That window, I didn't know what to think. Was someone out here with me? Watching me? I went back inside and locked the door. I didn't unpack that day. I kept my boots on and the shotgun close. I tried to tell myself someone had just passed through. Maybe another hiker. But barefoot? In this cold? That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the fire going and the shotgun in my lap. Around 2 a.m., I heard something again. This time it was clearer. A dragging sound, slow and scraping, like something being pulled through dirt. Then a thump, and another, from behind the cabin. I held my breath. My heart was pounding. I didn't move. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then a knock. A single, hard knock on the back wall. I stood frozen. I didn't make a sound. No footsteps. No voice. Just silence again. After an hour, I stood up and quietly looked out the window. Nothing. I stayed up until dawn. When the light came, I stepped outside. My hands were shaking. I went around the cabin slowly. On the back wall, there were 2 muddy handprints, low to the ground, like someone had crouched there and leaned against it. The ground was disturbed too, like someone had been crawling. That was it. I packed everything by noon. I didn't eat. I didn't rest. I got everything into my pack, loaded the shotgun, and started hiking back. The trail felt longer. Every sound made me jump. I kept turning around, convinced I'd see someone behind me, but I never did. When I reached the truck, I threw my gear in the back and left without even looking back. The drive out felt like a blur. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway, hours later. That night, I booked a hotel in the nearest town. I never told anyone about it. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I haven't gone back. I think about it sometimes, especially those handprints and the tracks. Whoever it was, they never tried to hurt me. They never even tried to come inside. But they knew I was there. They watched me. A few months later, I heard from the same buddy who told me about the cabin. He said the Forest Service had started blocking off access to some old trails in that area. He didn't know why, just said they were calling it a safety thing. I still wonder about that metal box in the shed, bolted to the floor. I think about the barefoot prints, the knock, the dragging sound. I'll never forget that silence and how it felt like the woods were watching. That place wasn't haunted. There were no monsters, but someone was out there, and I wasn't supposed to see them. It was late September when I decided to take a break from everything. Work had been eating me alive. The city noise, the traffic, the endless meetings. I was done with it all. I needed silence, stillness, something real. A week alone in a remote cabin deep in the mountains of Colorado sounded like the perfect way to reset. I found the listing online. It wasn't fancy, just a small wooden cabin tucked far from the nearest road, surrounded by thick pine forest. The pictures showed an old stove, a wooden bed frame, a fireplace, and not much else. That's exactly what I wanted. No phone signal, no internet, no neighbors for miles. I booked it for 7 nights. The drive up was long. I left early in the morning and reached the base of the mountain by noon. After that, it was all gravel roads and steep climbs. The last 5 miles weren't even accessible by car. I had to park and hike the rest of the way. I packed light. Clothes, some canned food, a water filter, a flashlight, and a pistol I kept in my glove box. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I wasn't dumb either. The hike took nearly 2 hours. The trail was rough and barely visible in some places. My legs burned, and I was sweating through my shirt by the time the cabin came into view. It sat in a clearing just large enough to catch some sun during the day. The roof looked a bit worn, and the front porch creaked under my boots, but the lock turned easily, and the inside was clean enough. I dropped my pack, opened the windows, and let the cool mountain air flow in. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. That first night, I made a fire in the fireplace and ate a can of beans. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the wind brushing through the trees. I slept like a rock. The first couple of days were peaceful. I spent most of my time outside, exploring the woods, filtering water from a nearby stream, chopping some dry wood I found stacked behind the cabin. I had a journal with me and wrote in it every morning. Just simple things, how I slept, what I saw, what I felt. I noticed how quiet everything was. Too quiet sometimes. Not even birds during some parts of the day. On the third night, I woke up around 3 a.m. I didn't know why. Maybe it was just too quiet again. I laid there for a few minutes, trying to fall back asleep, when I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, just a soft, slow crunching sound, like boots stepping on dry pine needles. I sat up and held my breath. The sound came again, closer this time. I reached for my flashlight and pointed it at the window. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the dark. I stayed awake until the sun came up. I told myself it could have been a deer or maybe a bear passing through, but I made sure to check around the cabin that morning. There were no prints, no broken branches, nothing. The days started feeling longer after that. I found myself checking over my shoulder more than I wanted to. I made sure the door was locked every night and kept my pistol on the nightstand. I didn't hear anything again for 2 nights, but on the 6th night, something changed. It was around midnight when I heard a thump outside. Not just footsteps this time. A sharp, heavy sound, like someone dropped something wooden on the porch. I froze. The fire had died down to just glowing embers. I stayed still, listening. Another thump. Then the unmistakable creak of the porch floorboards. I got up slowly, grabbed the pistol, and moved to the window. I didn't turn on any lights. I peered through the crack in the curtain, trying to see anything. There was nothing. The wind had stopped. Even the trees stood still. I stayed by the window for what felt like hours. Finally, the night passed without anything else happening. In the morning, I checked the porch. There were 2 deep gouges in the wood, like something had been dragged across it. That was it. No prints again. No sign of an animal. I thought about leaving, packing up and hiking back down early. But I told myself I was overreacting. It was probably a fallen branch or maybe an animal I didn't see. I only had 1 night left. That last day felt like it never ended. I didn't go outside much. I stayed near the cabin and kept the door shut. Around dusk, clouds rolled in. A storm was coming. I heard thunder far in the distance. By nightfall, the rain had started. The storm hit hard. Wind slammed against the cabin, and rain poured like buckets on the roof. I built up the fire as much as I could, trying to keep the place warm. I felt safer with all the noise. It drowned out anything else that might be outside. Just after 2 a.m., the power went out. The few lights I had running on a small generator went dead. I lit a lantern and sat near the fire. I was trying to calm down, tell myself it was just a storm, but then I heard it again, that same crunching outside. Then a knock, not a loud bang, a slow, soft knock, 3 times, then silence. I didn't move. I kept the pistol in one hand and the lantern in the other. Minutes passed, then more knocking, same pattern. 3 slow knocks. I moved to the door, stepped as quietly as I could. I didn't say anything. I just listened. Then something slid under the door. It was a piece of paper, old, wet, folded once. Picked it up and opened it. There was no writing on it, just a rough sketch, a drawing of the cabin, my cabin, with a stick figure drawn inside it. Alone, my blood ran cold. I backed away, heart pounding. I aimed the pistol at the door and waited. The knocking stopped. I didn't sleep. I sat in a corner of the cabin, watching the door until daylight. When the sun came up, I packed everything in less than 10 minutes. I didn't eat, didn't even clean up. I just grabbed my bag and left. I didn't look back at the cabin. The hike back felt longer than before. I kept hearing things behind me. Snaps, rustling, something moving just out of sight. I didn't stop. I didn't rest. I made it to my car and drove without stopping until I reached a gas station 3 hours away. I sat in the lot for almost an hour before I could breathe normally again. I never told anyone about it. I never went back. A few weeks later, I checked the listing again. It was gone, like it was never there. I still have the piece of paper. I keep it in a locked drawer at home. I don't know who drew it. I don't know what they wanted. But I know someone was up there with me, and they were watching the whole time. It was the middle of October when I decided to take a break from everything. I'd been working nonstop at a job I hated and dealing with city noise that never let me sleep right. I wasn't burnt out completely, but I was getting close. So, I took a week off and drove out to a cabin I found online. It was up in northern Minnesota, tucked into a dense forest near a small, quiet lake. The photos looked peaceful. One of those simple wooden cabins with a porch out front and smoke curling from the chimney. The owner said it was private and that the closest neighbor was nearly 2 miles away. I wanted that kind of isolation. No people, no traffic, no screens, just woods, the lake, and maybe some long walks to clear my head. I brought books, groceries for a week, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and my hunting knife even though I wasn't planning to use it. I had no intention of hiking too far into the woods. I just wanted quiet. The drive took most of the day. As I went further north, the roads got narrower and rougher, turning into gravel near the end. Trees pressed in on both sides, and I barely had signal by the time I pulled into the driveway. The cabin looked just like the pictures. It sat on a little hill, surrounded by tall pines and maples, the leaves orange and red and falling like slow rain in the breeze. A narrow dirt path led down to the lake, which shimmered through the trees. Inside, the cabin was small but clean. It had a wood stove in the corner, a kitchen with just the basics, a table with 2 chairs, and a bed with a heavy quilt on it. There was a bathroom too, small but working. I unpacked, lit the stove, and spent the first evening sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip below the trees. It was quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear every leaf fall, every creak of wood, every bird that calls from deep in the woods. I slept like a rock that night. The next few days were calm. I woke with the sun, made coffee, read for hours, and walked down to the lake in the afternoons. I saw deer, squirrels, and a fox once. Nothing threatening. I was more relaxed than I'd been in years. But on the 4th night, something changed. I was sitting in bed reading around 10 when I heard something outside. It was a faint crunching sound, like footsteps. I figured it was an animal at first. A deer maybe, but then it stopped. Then it started again, closer this time. A few more slow crunches on the dry leaves. Then silence. I put my book down and waited. I don't scare easy, but when you're alone in the woods with no phone signal, your senses stay sharp. I stayed still for a while. Then I got up, walked quietly to the window and looked out. I didn't see anything. The porch light only lit a small area in front of the cabin. Beyond that was just black woods. I waited a bit longer and then went back to bed. I didn't sleep well. Every little noise kept pulling me half awake. I thought I heard something again around 2 in the morning. Maybe a thump against the porch. But I didn't get up. I told myself it was just my brain making things up because I was half asleep. In the morning, I walked around the cabin just to make sure everything looked fine. I noticed faint marks in the dirt near the porch steps. Not footprints exactly, but something had disturbed the leaves and soil. I crouched down and looked at them closely. They weren't from shoes, more like something being dragged. Maybe an animal had pulled something up the steps, but nothing seemed out of place. I tried to shake it off. I went down to the lake that day and sat by the water for hours, skipping rocks and watching the wind move through the trees. But I kept looking back over my shoulder. I couldn't relax the same way anymore. When I went back to the cabin, I noticed something else. The small stack of firewood I'd neatly arranged was scattered. Not much, just a few logs shifted out of place. Again, maybe an animal, maybe the wind, but it didn't feel right. That night, I made sure the doors were locked and the windows shut tight. I kept the flashlight by the bed and slept with the hunting knife under my pillow, just in case. I was drifting off when I heard it again. The same slow, steady crunching of footsteps. This time it came right up to the porch, then stopped. For a long time there was nothing, no movement, no sound. Then something knocked, not loud, just a single solid knock against the front door. I didn't move. My heart was pounding in my chest. I lay there frozen, gripping the knife under the pillow. Another knock, same volume, same rhythm, just one knock, then silence. I waited for what felt like hours. Eventually I fell asleep, but it wasn't real sleep. more like a tense, foggy half-sleep filled with shadows. In the morning, I didn't go outside right away. I looked through the window first. Nothing out of place. When I finally stepped out onto the porch, I checked the door. There were smudges on it. Not fingerprints, more like wide, flat marks, as if someone had pressed their palm or something flat against the wood. My skin crawled. I walked around the cabin again. Same faint drag marks in the dirt. They were fresher now, clearer. Something had definitely been here. At this point, I was thinking about leaving early, but I kept telling myself it was probably an animal. A bear maybe, or a raccoon messing with things. But knocking on the door? That didn't fit. That afternoon, I walked further into the woods than I had before. I followed a narrow trail that twisted through the trees and eventually looped back toward the lake. On the way back, I noticed something off the path. A small clearing, maybe 50 feet wide. In the middle of it was a dead tree with deep cuts in the bark. Long, straight cuts, too clean to be from animals. Almost like knife marks. I looked around the clearing. There were bones. Small ones at first, squirrels, rabbits, maybe a raccoon. But then I saw something bigger. A deer skull half buried in leaves, with a rusty wire wrapped around the antlers. I didn't stay there long. I walked fast back to the cabin, trying to stay calm. But the silence in the woods felt heavier now, more deliberate, like I was being watched. That night, I barely slept. I kept the lights on. I didn't hear anything for a while, but just after midnight, the knocking came again. This time, 3 knocks. All slow, all steady. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I waited for it to stop. Then something brushed against the side of the cabin. I heard it, a scraping noise, low and slow. Then footsteps moving around to the back. I grabbed my flashlight and knife and sat in the corner of the room, facing the door, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Eventually the sounds stopped. Morning couldn't come fast enough. That day, I packed everything. I didn't even eat breakfast. I shoved it all into the car and drove out as fast as the dirt road would let me. I didn't care about the deposit. I didn't look back. I just kept driving. A few hours later, I got signal again. My phone buzzed with old messages. I called my brother and told him I was heading home early. I didn't tell him everything, just that the place was creepy. A week later, I looked up the area. I didn't find much, but I did find an old forum post from a hunter, dated back to 2009. He'd stayed in the same general area and mentioned strange things. Noises at night, drag marks in the dirt, someone or something knocking on his tent. He cut his trip short too. I don't know what's out there. I don't care anymore. I haven't gone camping since. That week in the woods drained something out of me. I still think about those knocks sometimes when the house is quiet at night. I never found out who or what was outside my cabin. But I know this much. It knew I was in there, and it wanted me to know it too. It was late October when I decided to take a break from work and rent a small cabin deep in the mountains of northern Idaho. I had been living in Spokane for the last 3 years, and the stress from my job, city noise, and just the pace of everything had worn me out. I wanted quiet, fresh air, and a change of scenery. I booked the cabin for 9 days. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, nothing. It sat on a small lake far from town, with just one old dirt road leading to it. The drive there took longer than I expected. The road was steep and full of turns, most of it barely wide enough for one vehicle. Leaves covered the gravel in shades of orange and brown. There were no signs, no cabins or houses for miles. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already starting to drop behind the hills. The place looked older than the pictures, but it was solid. It was made of thick logs, with a green tin roof and one large front window. The front porch had a bench swing that creaked when the wind blew. Inside, it was simple. One bedroom, a small kitchen, a fireplace, a couch, and a little dining table. There was a narrow staircase that led to a loft area with a mattress on the floor. The only heat came from the fireplace and a couple of old space heaters. There were no neighbors, no lights in the distance, just woods and hills around me. Felt peaceful at first. I unpacked my bags and set up my food supply, mostly canned stuff and dry goods. I brought a small cooler for perishables, but I figured the cold weather would help preserve things. That first night was quiet. Too quiet. I didn't realize how used to background noise I'd become until I noticed the silence. No hum from electronics, no distant traffic. Nothing. Just the occasional rustling of leaves outside and the creaks of the old cabin settling. I lit a fire, read a book, and went to sleep early. I remember waking up a couple times to the sound of branches tapping against the windows. The wind had picked up. The next morning, I got up and made coffee on the gas stove. It was cold, maybe in the upper 30s, and my breath hung in the air inside the cabin. I wore layers, gloves, and a beanie. I walked around the property, which was mostly a clearing surrounded by thick woods. There was a small trail that led down to the lake, about 200 yards away. The water was calm, and fog hovered over the surface. There was an old canoe half buried in the reeds, but I didn't trust it to hold weight. I spent most of the day reading, writing in my notebook, and chopping some firewood. That night, things started to feel different. I was in bed, just about to fall asleep, when I heard a thud outside. It sounded like something heavy hitting the ground. Then nothing. I sat up and listened. No more noises. I told myself it was probably a branch or a log falling. The cabin was old and didn't have curtains in the loft, so I could see the tops of the trees through the big front window. The moon was half full and lit up the yard a little. I stayed awake for about an hour just listening. Finally, I fell asleep. The next day, I found something strange. About 30 feet from the front steps, there were large drag marks in the dirt and leaves. It looked like something heavy had been dragged from the woods toward the cabin, then veered off to the right. I followed the marks with my eyes, and they disappeared behind some dense brush. I walked over to them but didn't see much. No footprints, no sign of blood or fur, just those wide drag marks about 2 feet apart. I spent the day trying not to think about it. I kept a hatchet on me just in case. I figured it could have been a deer or a bear dragging something, but it still made me feel uneasy. That night, the wind picked up again. Around midnight, I heard another noise. This time, it was a slow, steady scraping sound, like something was being pulled or dragged again right outside. I got out of bed and crawled over to the window. I couldn't see anything, but the sound kept going. Then it stopped. I waited, staring out into the darkness. I didn't sleep much that night. On the fourth day, I found the drag marks again. This time they were closer, right in front of the porch steps. They curved off to the side of the cabin, toward the back. I slowly walked around the cabin, holding the hatchet tight. I didn't see anything at first, but then I noticed a small pile of broken twigs and leaves, like something had been dropped or picked up there. There were long scratches on the dirt, maybe made by claws or tools. I checked the windows and doors. Everything was still locked. I spent the rest of that day inside. I barely ate. I kept the fire going and blocked the windows in the loft with blankets. I didn't want to see outside anymore. I was tired but didn't want to sleep. I kept thinking about what could be out there. No animals I knew left marks like that. And why come back night after night? That night, around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps. Not animals. Heavy, slow footsteps on the porch. Then a single knock on the door. Just one. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I didn't move. After maybe 2 minutes, I heard the creak of the porch swing moving. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. Eventually, the sounds stopped. The next morning, I opened the door. Nothing there. No tracks. No sign anyone had been there. But the swing was still swaying, even though the air was completely still. I started thinking I should leave, but part of me didn't want to seem like I was panicking. I told myself maybe it was my imagination. Maybe I was overreacting. That night, everything changed. Around 3 a.m., I was woken up by a loud bang. Something had hit the side of the cabin hard. Then another bang. Then scratching. I ran downstairs and grabbed my flashlight and boots. I flung open the front door and scanned the clearing. I saw nothing. Then I saw movement at the tree line. A figure, a man or something that looked like a man, crouched and then stood. He was wearing dark clothes, and something shiny hung from his belt. I didn't wait. I slammed the door, locked it, and shoved the couch in front of it. I kept the hatchet in my hand until morning. When daylight came, I went outside with the hatchet and flashlight. I followed the edge of the woods where I saw the figure. There were boot prints in the dirt. Big ones. Not work boots. Not hiking boots. Military style. I followed them for about 60 yards before they vanished into the undergrowth. I felt sick. Someone was watching the cabin. Someone had been coming around every night. I packed everything I could fit into my backpack and started hiking down the road. I left food and heavy stuff behind. I didn't care. I just wanted to get back to my truck and leave. The hike down took me almost 4 hours because I kept stopping to listen. I kept feeling like someone was behind me. When I got to the truck, I almost cried. I jumped in, locked the doors, and drove straight back to Spokane. When I got home, I called the rental company. They said I was the only person who had booked that cabin for weeks. I didn't report anything. I didn't tell anyone. I just didn't want to deal with it. But I still think about those nights. The dragging sounds. The knock. The man in the woods. It was real, and it still makes my skin crawl. I'll never go back to that cabin. Not ever again. It was late October when I decided to rent a cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. I'd been working nonstop for over a year, stuck behind a screen, and I felt like my brain was rotting. I didn't want a beach or a city. I wanted quiet, solitude, space to think and clear my head. I wanted to wake up to silence, breathe in clean air, and hear nothing but birds and wind in the trees. The cabin was small and plain, nothing fancy. Just 4 walls, a wood stove, a cot, and a little kitchen with a propane stove and a cooler. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal. That was the point. The guy I rented it from met me in town, handed me the keys, and gave me a paper map with the trail marked out. He said the nearest house was about 5 miles away. That sounded perfect. The hike to the cabin took almost 2 hours. It was colder than I expected, and the leaves had mostly dropped, leaving bare trees creaking in the wind. The place was tucked into a small clearing surrounded by dense woods. The door stuck a little when I opened it, but inside it was dry and clean. There was even a pile of firewood stacked against the wall. I got the stove going, set my stuff down, and felt myself start to relax for the first time in months. The first day was quiet. I made some tea, read a book, and went to bed early. I brought a sleeping bag and a thick wool blanket, and the fire kept the cabin warm enough through the night. The silence was incredible. Not a single car or voice, just the occasional rustle outside. It felt like the earth was actually resting. The second day, I took a walk. I followed a narrow trail down toward a small frozen-over pond I'd seen on the map. The air was so dry it made my nose sting, and my boots crunched on the frost-covered ground. I didn't see any wildlife, just a few squirrel tracks and a frozen set of deer prints near the edge of the water. I sat for a while on a log and just stared out over the pond. I wasn't used to doing nothing. It made me uncomfortable at first, like I was wasting time, but I stayed there for over an hour. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of something hitting the side of the cabin. Just one thump, then silence. I sat up and waited. Nothing else happened. I figured it was probably a branch falling. The wind had picked up earlier, and the trees were always swaying and creaking. I lay back down but didn't fall asleep right away. I stared at the ceiling and listened. The next morning, I went outside and checked around the cabin. I saw something strange under the kitchen window. At first, I thought it was just dirt or pine needles, but when I looked closer, it was a footprint, not a boot, a barefoot human print. It was faint and partly smeared, but definitely a foot. I crouched down and stared at it for a long time. The print wasn't huge, maybe a size 10 or 11, but the toes were spread out, like someone had been standing still. It didn't make sense. It had been well below freezing overnight. No one would be out here barefoot. And even if they were, how had they gotten this far without shoes? I looked around but didn't see any other prints. Just that one under the window. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was mine somehow from when I first got there. But I'd never gone barefoot, and I hadn't walked around that side of the cabin yet. I tried to let it go. I made breakfast, went for a short walk, and spent the afternoon reading. But I kept thinking about that footprint. It had been so clean, so recent. That night, I triple-checked the lock on the door. I pulled a chair in front of it just in case. I didn't know why. Nothing had really happened, but something felt off. I had trouble falling asleep. I lay in the cot for hours, staring at the ceiling again, listening to every sound. The wind, the fire cracking. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. A thump, not loud, just a single knock like something soft hitting the wall. Then, a few seconds later, another, a little closer to the door. I held my breath. There was no more sound after that. Nothing. I stayed awake the rest of the night. The next morning, I made up my mind to hike out and go back to town. I felt stupid, like I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching the cabin. Maybe just a hunter or a hiker who got turned around, but still, it didn't sit right with me. I packed my bag and left most of the food behind to lighten the load. About 15 minutes into the hike back, I saw something hanging from a tree just off the trail. It was a piece of fabric. At first, I thought it was trash, but when I got closer, I saw that it was a torn strip of flannel, like from a shirt. It had dried blood on it. I froze, just stood there, staring at it. The blood had soaked through part of it and crusted over. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't that old either. I looked around, but the woods were dead quiet. No movement, no sound. I kept walking, a little faster now. I didn't stop again. I didn't look back. It took over 2 hours to get to the road. When I finally got cell service again, I called the guy I rented the place from. Told him I was done and would leave the keys at the store. He didn't ask why. I stayed in a motel that night. Couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my head. The footprint, the noise, the cloth. I told myself it could all be explained. A lost camper, an animal, my own paranoia, but it didn't feel like that. A few days later, after I'd gotten home, I tried looking up reports from that area. I didn't find much, just one article months old about a missing man, a solo hiker. No body had ever been found. I kept thinking about how far that cabin was from anything. No roads, no houses, just woods. And whoever had stood under my window that night hadn't tried to break in. They hadn't even made much noise. They just watched. I never went back. I didn't talk about it to anyone for a long time. Felt like a dream. But every once in a while, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I remember that quiet knock on the wall and the bare footprint in the frost. And I wonder if that guy who went missing ever made it to a cabin, or if someone else had been using mine before I got there. All I know is someone was out there, and they weren't lost. They were watching and waiting. It was the beginning of October when I decided to head out to a small cabin in the mountains of northern Idaho. I had found it online, listed as a remote off-grid rental with no cell service, no neighbors, and no real connection to the outside world. That was exactly what I needed at the time. Life had been beating down on me. Work was nonstop stress. My relationships were strained, and I hadn't had a proper night's sleep in months. I figured a week alone in the woods might help me reset. The drive took nearly 8 hours from my apartment. By the time I got close, the road turned into gravel, then narrowed to a rutted dirt track winding through thick pine forest. The trees crowded in tighter the deeper I went. Eventually, I saw the wooden sign that just said, Trailhead Cabin, with an arrow pointing left. I followed it, and after about 10 more minutes of crawling along in first gear, I found the place. The cabin was small, made of dark logs with a steep green metal roof. It sat in a clearing barely large enough for it. The trees loomed all around. There was a narrow wooden deck out front and a big rusted propane tank off to the side. The key had been hidden in a little lockbox on the railing. When I stepped inside, I was hit by the strong smell of old wood and dust. It felt like no one had been there for a long time. Inside, it was simple but comfortable. A little kitchen with a propane stove, a small fridge powered by solar, a table with 2 chairs, and a worn-out couch facing a black cast-iron wood stove. In the back was a bedroom with a full-size bed and a thin mattress. The windows were small and square, all with heavy wooden shutters you could close from inside. There was no internet, no TV, no cell signal. I had brought food, a pile of firewood, and a few books. I planned to hike, sleep, and sit in silence. The first 2 days went as planned. I woke up to the sound of birds and wind. I went for long walks along the trails behind the cabin. I made simple meals. I sat in the sun and tried to think of nothing. On the third night, things changed. It started with the sound of crunching in the woods. I was sitting on the deck just after sunset. The forest had gone dark, but the sky was still a little blue. I heard something walking through the trees. Not a small animal, something heavier. At first I thought it might be a deer, but the steps sounded too slow and deliberate, like someone walking, trying not to make noise. I stood up and peered into the woods, but I couldn't see anything. Eventually the sounds stopped. I didn't think much of it. Probably a bear. I went inside, locked the door, and shoved a log into the wood stove. That night I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing soft noises outside, but I told myself it was the wind. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. About 30 feet from the deck, I saw something odd. There was a small pile of rocks stacked into a rough pyramid, right in the middle of the clearing. It hadn't been there before. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't big, maybe 2 feet high, but it was too deliberate to be random. I didn't touch it. I just walked back inside and tried to shake off the unease. Later that afternoon, I hiked up the ridge behind the cabin. The trail was narrow and went straight uphill. It took nearly an hour to reach the top, where there was a flat spot with a view through the trees. You could see for miles. When I turned to head back down, I stopped. About 10 feet off the trail, there was another pile of rocks. Same size, same shape. That night, I closed the shutters over all the windows and double-checked the lock on the door. I kept the hatchet I brought with me next to the bed. I didn't sleep much. The next day, I decided to hike out further. I followed a different trail that led down to a creek. It was peaceful down there, the water shallow and clear. I sat on a rock for a while, trying to let my mind settle. When I stood up to leave, I noticed another pile of rocks. This one was right at the edge of the water. It hadn't been there when I arrived. I started walking faster. Back at the cabin, I spent the rest of the day checking the windows, checking the doors, walking in circles. I didn't go outside after sunset. I kept all the lights off. I sat on the floor with my back to the wall and listened. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the deck. Slow, heavy. The boards creaked one at a time. I sat completely still, heart pounding in my ears. The steps moved toward the door, then stopped. I didn't move. After what felt like an hour, I heard the steps again, this time walking away. The next morning, I found deep boot prints in the dirt just outside the door. They weren't mine. I packed my things. I didn't even eat breakfast. I threw everything into the car and started driving. But the road out wasn't the same. I drove for 20 minutes and ended up back at the cabin. I turned around and tried again, thinking I had made a wrong turn. This time I ended up deeper in the woods, where the trees were thicker and the road started to vanish. I reversed and drove back. I parked and sat in the car for a long time. My map wasn't any help. The GPS didn't work. I had no signal. I decided to wait until morning and try again with daylight. That night, I slept in the car with the doors locked. I kept the hatchet on the passenger seat. Sometime around 3 a.m., I woke up to a tapping sound. Not loud, just steady. Tap, tap, tap. I turned on the flashlight and looked around. The front windshield was fogged up, but through the fog, I saw a handprint, clear and fresh, pressed right up against the glass. I started the engine and drove. I didn't care where. I just wanted to get out. I kept driving until the road ended again. Another dead end. No way through. I backed up, drove a different way. Same thing. Every direction looped me back. I spent the whole next day walking. I followed the trail I had come in on. It looked right at first, but after an hour I was in a place I didn't recognize. I climbed a ridge to get my bearings, and when I looked down, I saw the cabin. Directly below me, It was like I couldn't leave. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't turn on any lights. I sat in the corner with the hatchet and waited. I kept thinking about the rock piles, the handprint, the boots. Just before sunrise, I heard a loud thud on the roof. Then silence. Then another thud. I stood frozen. The third thud, right above my head. Then nothing. When it was light, I went outside. I climbed onto the deck railing and looked up. There were muddy boot prints on the metal roof. Walking from one side to the other. That morning, I made a plan. I took my backpack, filled it with food and water, and started walking. Not on the trail, just straight into the forest, using the sun to guide me. I hiked for hours through thick brush, over rocks, across a shallow creek. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Around late afternoon, I stumbled onto a logging road. It looked fresh. I followed it downhill. After another hour, I saw tire tracks. Then, in the distance, I heard an engine. It was a pickup truck. 2 men inside, both loggers. I flagged them down, explained I was lost. They drove me back to town. I didn't tell them everything, just that I got turned around hiking and couldn't find the road out. They offered to take me back up to get my car, but I said no. I told them to leave it. I didn't want anything to do with that place anymore. A week later, I hired someone to recover the vehicle. They said the road looked fine, no obstructions, nothing unusual. But I still remember those loops. The way the cabin kept showing up. The rock piles. The boot prints on the roof. I never went back. I never will. And even now, sometimes, I dream of the sound of slow footsteps outside my door. I needed a break. My job had been eating me alive for months. Waking up early, getting home late, staring at computer screens all day, and trying to sleep through stress-filled nights. I felt like I was forgetting who I was. So I took a week off, told my coworkers not to call unless the office was burning down, and packed up my truck. I booked a small cabin in the mountains, just far enough that cell signal would be spotty and close enough that I could reach it in a day's drive. The cabin was about 25 miles outside a small town, tucked deep in a wooded valley. There was a lake nearby, a fire pit out front, and a thick line of trees wrapping around the entire place. The online pictures made it look peaceful. Just a tiny wooden box with a porch, a chimney, and 2 rocking chairs facing the woods. That's what I wanted. No noise, no people, no internet. Just a bed, a stove, and trees. I left early in the morning. The drive took 8 hours, most of it along winding forest roads where I saw more deer than other cars. When I finally got there, the air smelled cleaner than anything I remembered. Pines and dirt and cold water. I unlocked the front door with the key the owner had left in a rusted box on the porch. Everything inside was as simple as I expected. A small kitchen, a twin bed with a thick wool blanket, a bathroom with a cranky old toilet. There was no TV, no microwave, and only one outlet. I spent the first day exploring around the cabin, checking for trails and figuring out where the sun would set. I didn't go too far, just enough to get familiar with the area. I found a path that led down to the lake and another that curved up along a ridgeline. I saw an old log partially rotted and covered with moss, and a few sets of animal tracks in the soft ground. That night, I lit a fire in the pit outside and sat by it, listening to the woods settle into silence. Took some time to get used to it. The quiet was almost heavy. The next morning, I went hiking along the ridgeline. The trail went up and curved west, giving me a better view of the valley. I brought water, some food, and a flashlight. I didn't plan to be out too long. As I climbed, the trees got thinner, and I could see the edge of the lake in the distance. I stopped to rest on a flat rock and realized I hadn't heard a single person since I'd arrived. No engines, no voices. It was strange but also peaceful. Later that afternoon, I turned around and headed back. I passed the same moss-covered log and the same tracks, but something felt slightly different. I couldn't explain what exactly, but the silence now seemed deeper than before. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. I brushed it off and returned to the cabin before dark. I ate, read a book, and fell asleep early. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. There was a sound outside. Not loud, just movement. Leaves brushing together, sticks cracking lightly. I stayed in bed at first, listening. I figured it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but it didn't move off like animals usually do. The sound stayed near the side of the cabin. I sat up and listened harder. After a few minutes, it stopped. I got out of bed, turned on the porch light, and looked outside. Nothing. I told myself I was being jumpy. It was just the forest. I went back to bed. The rest of the night passed quietly. The following day, I decided to explore the other trail, the one leading down to the lake. The ground was soft from rain earlier in the week, and the trail curved between tall pines. I followed it for nearly a mile until I reached the shoreline. The lake was calm and flat, surrounded by trees on all sides. I sat on a rock and watched a few ducks paddling near the far edge. I stayed there for a while. It was peaceful. On my way back up the trail, I noticed something odd. About 100 feet off the main path, there was a small clearing. It looked like someone had cleared out a few trees. I hadn't seen it before. Curious, I stepped off the trail and pushed through the brush. The clearing was maybe 20 feet wide, with old stumps in the middle. A circle of stones lay near one side, like someone had made a small fire pit a long time ago. There was a broken bench too, half sunk into the dirt. I didn't stay long. The place felt strange. Not dangerous exactly, but off, like it had been forgotten for a reason. I walked back to the cabin and spent the rest of the evening on the porch. That night, I woke up again. This time, the sound was on the other side of the cabin. Slower, more deliberate. It was like someone or something was walking carefully around the edge. I stayed still. My heart was pounding. I listened. After 5 minutes, it stopped. Again, I checked outside. Nothing. Just trees and dark. The next morning, I saw something that made me feel sick. Just behind the cabin, near the tree line, were tracks. Footprints. They were faint but clear. They weren't animal. Too long, too narrow, and barefoot. I followed them for a few feet, but they vanished near the brush. I had locked the cabin the night before, and all the windows were shut. I tried not to panic. Maybe they were old. Maybe I hadn't noticed them before. But in the back of my mind, I knew I had. I stayed close to the cabin that day. I kept the door locked and the flashlight in my pocket. I didn't hear anything that night, but I barely slept. Every creak of the wood, every shift in the wind, I sat up. I watched the window until the sky turned gray. On the 5th day, I walked back to that strange clearing. I wanted to see it again in the daylight, more carefully this time. When I got there, I saw something new. A piece of rope hanging from a low branch. It looked old and frayed. I also noticed marks on one of the stumps. Scratches, like someone had carved into the wood with a knife. I couldn't make out the shapes. They weren't letters, just lines. I didn't stay long. That night, I heard the sounds again. This time, they didn't circle the cabin. They stayed in one spot, right outside the back window, for nearly an hour. I didn't move. I didn't breathe too loud. I just waited. When the sun rose, I checked. No footprints, no signs of anything, but I felt watched. On the 6th day, I made up my mind to leave early. I packed my stuff, loaded the truck, and cleaned the cabin. I planned to leave before sunset, but when I turned the key, the truck wouldn't start. I tried again. Nothing. The battery wasn't dead, but it wouldn't catch. I popped the hood and checked what I could. Everything looked fine, but it wouldn't start. I felt a tightness in my chest. I wasn't panicking, but I was close. There was no cell signal. The nearest town was 25 miles away. I could walk it, but I didn't want to be in those woods after dark. I stayed one more night. I kept the lights on. I kept the flashlight and a knife next to me. I didn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., the sound came back. This time, it was louder. Steps, slow, crunching leaves. Then silence. Then a single, light knock on the side of the cabin. Just one. I froze. I didn't move for hours. When light finally came, I walked outside. Nothing there. But I didn't waste time. I packed what I could carry, locked the cabin, and started walking. I hiked all day. I didn't stop. I didn't eat. By late afternoon, I reached the road. A logging truck passed about an hour later, and I flagged it down. The driver let me ride in the back to the next town. I didn't explain much. I just said my truck broke down. Later, I had the truck towed. The mechanic couldn't find anything wrong with it. Said it started on the first try. I didn't care. I sold it a week later. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know I wasn't alone. And I know it wasn't my imagination. Something watched me, followed me, waited until I was vulnerable. I made it out, but just barely. Now, I keep my distance from quiet places, because sometimes silence doesn't mean peace. Sometimes it means something is waiting. It was early October when I decided to take a week off and head to the mountains. I had been working long hours, barely sleeping, and felt like I was on the edge of burning out. I needed time away from everything: people, work, noise. I found a listing online for a small cabin tucked deep in the woods of northern Montana, not far from Glacier National Park. It was cheap, isolated, and looked rough but sturdy. There was no cell reception out there, and I liked that. I wanted silence. I wanted to disconnect. The cabin was about 4 hours from the nearest town. The last hour was on a dirt road that wound through thick trees, barely wide enough for one vehicle. I had to slow down to a crawl just to avoid sliding into the ditches lining the road. The trees formed a dense canopy overhead, so even during the day it felt like evening. When I finally reached the cabin, it was just as the photos showed. Weathered wood, metal roof, one small window in the front, and a sagging porch. It sat at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by pine forest. No other cabins or buildings in sight. There was a shed a few yards to the right, its door hanging off the hinges. I parked the car and stepped out. The cold hit me immediately. It wasn't snowing yet, but the air felt like it could at any moment. I walked around the cabin first. There were animal tracks all over the soft dirt. Deer mostly, maybe a coyote. I wasn't too concerned. I grew up around forests like this. As long as I kept food sealed and didn't leave trash out, I'd be fine. Inside, the cabin was about as simple as it could get. One room, a wood stove in the corner, a small table, a chair, and a cot. There was a tiny kitchen area with a sink and a counter, though the plumbing didn't work. There was an outhouse about 50 feet behind the cabin. Smelled awful but would do for a week. The floor creaked with every step, and the whole place smelled like dry wood and old smoke. There were a few cans of food in the cupboard and a water barrel beside the sink. I had brought my own food and a few gallons of water just in case. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, gathered some firewood from the pile beside the shed, and made a small fire in the stove. It warmed up quickly, and I found myself dozing off even before the sun had fully gone down. That night, I slept hard, deeper than I had in months. The silence out there was unbelievable. No traffic, no buzzing phones, just the wind in the trees. The next morning, I made some coffee using a small camping stove I brought and stepped outside. It was colder, and a thick fog had rolled in during the night. The forest around the cabin was quiet. Too quiet. Even the birds seemed absent. I stood there for a while, watching my breath in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I brushed it off as my brain not being used to the stillness. That day I hiked a little. I didn't stray too far from the cabin since the trees were dense and the trail markers were faded. I made it about 2 miles out before turning back. When I got back to the clearing, something was off. I couldn't place it at first. Then I noticed a fresh set of tracks near the porch. Boots, not mine. They came from the woods, walked straight up to the cabin, and circled around the back. My stomach dropped. I followed the tracks around the cabin. They stopped just beneath the back window. I stared at them for a long time. There were no tracks leading away. I looked around the trees, scanned the forest. Nothing, just fog and silence. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat on the cot for a long time. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire low and listened. I couldn't hear anything, but that was the problem. I should have heard something. Wind, branches, an owl, anything. but there was nothing. The silence was thick. At one point in the night, I thought I heard light footsteps on the porch. I held my breath, barely blinking. I stayed that way until dawn. The next day, I debated packing up and leaving, but I talked myself out of it. Could have been a hunter or some local wandering around. Still, I felt different. My body was tense. My head hurt. I started locking the door even when I went out to the outhouse. I double-checked it every hour. I kept my knife on me, even inside. Later that afternoon, I walked out to the shed. I hadn't opened it yet. The inside was dark, smelled like mold and old wood. There were rusted tools on the wall, a broken axe, an old wheelbarrow. In the corner, I found a stack of weathered notebooks under a dirty tarp. I took one back inside and flipped through it. It was full of short notes, dates, weather, and little details about the forest. Most of it was boring. One page caught my eye. It was dated 6 years earlier and said, "He comes out when it's quiet. Don't go out at night. Don't follow the sounds. Don't let him see you." I felt cold all over. I shoved the notebook under the cot. I didn't want to look at it anymore. That night, I didn't sleep again. I kept the fire going, sat in the chair facing the door, and held my knife. Around midnight, I heard the sound of leaves crunching outside. Slow, deliberate. I stood up, careful not to make noise. The steps moved across the porch. Then silence. A moment later, I heard the doorknob rattle. Not hard, just a slow turn. Then it stopped. No footsteps walking away. I didn't move. My chest felt tight. I stayed like that until the fire died down and it was morning again. I checked outside. No tracks this time. Nothing disturbed. But the unease didn't leave me. I barely ate that day. I just paced inside the cabin. I thought about driving back to town, but I knew how bad the road was. If I left at night and something happened, I'd be stuck out there. I told myself I'd leave first thing the next morning. That evening, I loaded up the car. I kept only the bare essentials inside the cabin. When the sun dropped, I sat in the corner, away from the windows, with my knife and flashlight. I waited. Nothing happened for a long time. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard something scratching at the side of the cabin. Long, slow scrapes along the wood. I didn't move. Then it stopped. A few minutes later, I heard something heavy step onto the porch. The floorboards creaked. Then silence. Then a loud thump, like something had hit the door hard. Not trying to break in, just a warning. I sat there all night, shaking. When dawn came, I didn't waste time. I threw the rest of my things into the car, didn't care about the mess. I didn't even bother checking around the cabin. I just got in, started the engine, and drove. The road was worse after the cold nights. Ice had formed in patches, and I skidded more than once. But I kept going. By the time I reached the town, it was late morning. I stopped at a gas station, filled up, and sat in the car for almost an hour. I kept watching the road, expecting to see something come out of the trees. But nothing did. I never went back for the rest of my stuff. I reported what happened to the property owner, but they didn't respond. I found out later that the cabin hadn't been officially rented in over a year. The listing was old. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone had reposted it by accident. I don't know. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in my apartment made me jump. I started keeping a knife by the bed. I even moved to a new place eventually. Somewhere in the city, surrounded by noise, people, light. I still think about that cabin, about the footsteps, the scratching, the silence. Whatever was out there, I don't think it was a ghost or some monster. I think it was a person, someone who lives out there, someone who doesn't want to be found, someone who watches from the trees when it's quiet, someone who doesn't leave footprints. That's what scares me the most. Not what I saw, but what I didn't. And I know I won't ever go that deep into the woods again. Not alone. Not ever. It was late October when I decided to take a break from the noise of everyday life. I'd been working long hours, stuck behind a desk with nothing but screens and paperwork around me. My back hurt, my eyes ached, My mind was running on fumes. I didn't want beaches or hotels or any crowded place. I just wanted quiet, solitude, a place where the only thing I could hear was the wind and maybe some birds. So I went looking for a remote cabin. I found one listed online by a guy who owned a bunch of property deep in the Appalachian Mountains. It wasn't fancy. It had no Wi-Fi, no cable, and barely a cell signal, but it had a wood stove, a generator, and enough space for one person to stretch out and breathe. The drive there took most of a day. I left before sunrise, stopping only to refuel and grab some food. The last hour of the drive was along dirt roads that twisted through dense trees. I passed no houses, no other cars, not even signs. Just forest. The GPS lost signal about 30 minutes before I reached the cabin, and from there I had to follow the printed directions the owner had emailed me. When I finally arrived, it was nearly dusk. The cabin sat in a small clearing at the edge of a hill, surrounded on all sides by tall pine and maple trees. It was made of old, dark wood with a sloped tin roof that looked like it had seen a few decades. There was a wraparound porch with a couple of creaky chairs and a small pile of firewood stacked near the front door. The generator sat about 20 feet away, hooked up to a line that ran underground. A rusty axe leaned against a tree stump near a smaller pile of kindling. It was just as I'd hoped. Isolated, simple, quiet. Inside, the cabin had a rustic feel. The walls were paneled with the same old wood as the outside. There was a small kitchen with a propane stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves stocked with canned goods, matches, and other basics. The bathroom was tiny, with a composting toilet and a gravity-fed shower rigged to a black water barrel up on a platform outside. The main room had a couch, a recliner, and a cast iron wood stove. In the corner was a twin bed with a heavy wool blanket folded neatly at the foot. I unpacked quickly, placing my food in the small cooler and my clothes in the single dresser. I turned on the generator for a bit of light and got the stove going with some dry logs I found stacked beside it. Once I was settled, I sat out on the porch with a thermos of coffee and watched the forest disappear into darkness. I could hear crickets, the rustle of leaves, and every now and then the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in years. The first night was calm. I slept better than I had in months, even with the strange creaks of the old cabin around me. In the morning, I made a simple breakfast and took a walk into the woods. I followed a rough path that led uphill and opened into a rocky outcrop with a view of the valley. The trees were just starting to turn red and orange. The air was cool but not cold, and the wind carried the smell of fallen leaves and damp earth. I spent most of that day outside, chopping a bit more wood, exploring the nearby trails, and reading by the fire. Everything felt good. It wasn't until the third night that things started to feel off. I had just gone to bed, the fire in the stove still giving off a low heat. I woke up around 2 or 3 a.m., not sure why. I was used to sleeping through the night. At first I thought it was a noise, but the cabin was quiet, completely quiet. No crickets, no wind, not even the trees swaying. It was so still that I could hear my own heartbeat. I sat up and looked toward the window. Nothing there. I checked the door. Still locked. I brushed it off as maybe a bad dream or my body adjusting to the silence. But the next morning, I noticed something strange. I had left a bag of trail mix on the table, sealed up. It was torn open and spilled all over the floor. At first I thought maybe a raccoon or something had gotten in, but there were no holes or open windows. The door was still locked from the inside. No scratches or signs of forced entry. I cleaned it up and moved on, but the thought lingered in the back of my mind. Later that day, I hiked further out. I wanted to clear my head and see more of the land around me. I brought a small backpack, some water, a snack, and a compass just in case. The trees got denser the further I went. After about an hour, I stumbled across an old fence line. It was barely standing, just a few rotted posts with strands of rusty barbed wire. Beyond it, I noticed what looked like an old hunting blind up in a tree. It was falling apart, but I climbed up anyway, curious. From there, I could see a clearing about 100 yards away. At first it looked empty, but then I noticed something strange. Piles of rocks, arranged in almost perfect circles, maybe 6 or 7 of them, Some looked recent, others older. There were no signs of animals or people, no tools or tents, just those piles. I climbed down and walked closer, but the whole area felt wrong. I don't know how to explain it, just a tightness in my chest, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I didn't stay long. Back at the cabin that evening, I kept looking out the windows, half expecting to see someone out in the trees. But there was nothing. No noise, no movement, just the same uneasy silence. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing small sounds, thumps, rustling. Once I thought I heard breathing right outside the wall. I held my breath, listening, frozen in bed. But nothing happened. Morning came, and again, everything looked normal. Then I noticed the axe was gone. It had been leaning against the stump when I got there. I hadn't touched it since the first day. Now it was gone. I walked around the clearing, checking behind the trees, even down the slope. Nothing. The pile of wood was undisturbed, but the axe was missing. I told myself maybe I had moved it and forgot. Maybe I'd set it down somewhere while working. But I knew I hadn't. That evening, I decided to shut everything tight. I brought in extra wood, locked the door, latched the windows, and turned off the generator early. I kept a flashlight and a long kitchen knife beside the bed, just in case. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, soft, slow, moving around the cabin. I stayed perfectly still. I could hear twigs snapping, then silence, then another sound, closer, maybe just outside the door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. But again, nothing happened. No knock, no break-in, just silence. The next day, I found footprints, human ones, not boots, bare feet, leading from the woods to the back of the cabin and then circling around. I followed them for about 20 feet into the trees before they vanished into the undergrowth. That's when I decided to leave early. I packed quickly, tossing everything into the car. I didn't bother folding clothes or finishing the food. I just wanted out. But when I got in the car and turned the key, nothing happened. Not a click, not a sound. The battery was dead. I checked the hood. Nothing looked wrong. The terminals were clean. No wires chewed. It had started just fine the day before. I tried again. Nothing. There was no cell service, and the nearest house was probably 10 miles back down that twisting dirt road. I didn't like it, but I knew I had no choice. I grabbed my backpack, filled it with water and food, and started walking. I left a note on the table in case anyone came by, not that I expected anyone to. I kept my knife in hand and stuck to the road. About an hour in, I got the feeling I was being followed. I'd stop and listen, and I'd hear footsteps stop too. When I moved, they moved. Not close, just far enough that I couldn't see who or what it was. I didn't call out. I didn't run. I just walked faster. It took me 5 hours to reach the first sign of people, an old mailbox beside a gravel driveway. From there, I walked another half-mile to a farmhouse. The man there let me use his phone. I called a tow truck and sat on his porch, explaining only that my car wouldn't start. He didn't ask questions. Maybe he could see the look on my face. They towed the car out the next morning. When the mechanic checked it, he said the battery was completely drained but not damaged. Just dead, like someone had left the headlights on for days. But I hadn't. I was careful about that. Always double-checked. He recharged it and it started fine after that. I never went back for my things. I never contacted the cabin owner. I didn't even leave a review. I just tried to forget it. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those footprints, about the missing axe, about the silent forest and the piles of rocks that made no sense. I think about how close whoever it was got to the cabin, and how long they might have been watching. And I don't sleep so well anymore. It started when I took time off from work after a long, exhausting year. I had saved up a few vacation days and I wanted to get away from everything. No emails, no traffic, no people. I booked a small, isolated cabin up north, surrounded by forest and far from the nearest town. I found it on a rental site that focused on off-grid spots, places people go when they want silence. The pictures showed an old wooden cabin with a porch, a chimney, and a small dock by a still lake. It looked perfect. The cabin sat on a piece of land thick with trees. The gravel road that led up to it was narrow and uneven, barely a road at all. My car bounced around the deeper I got into the woods, but I didn't mind. I liked that it was this remote. I didn't even tell many people I was going. I just said I needed a break and left it at that. When I got there, I parked beside the cabin and stepped out. The air was cool and clean. I didn't hear anything but the wind and the quiet chirp of birds. No cars, no machines, no human sounds. Felt good. The cabin was older than I expected, but still solid. It had a wooden deck in front with an old chair and a rusted grill. Inside, it was simple: a fireplace, a bed, a small kitchen with gas burners, and an old fridge that ran on propane. There was no TV, no radio, and no cell service. That was the point. I spent the first day unloading my stuff and getting settled. I brought books, a fishing rod, a few cans of food, and a cooler full of meat and drinks. I kept a notebook for journaling. I had no plans other than to relax, maybe hike a bit, maybe fish, mostly just rest. The first 2 days were great. I slept well, took walks in the woods, and sat by the lake for hours. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel small in a good way. I didn't see any people. I barely saw any animals, other than a few deer and squirrels. There was a trail behind the cabin that I followed a couple times, but I never went too far. The trees got thick quickly, and I didn't want to get lost. The trail wasn't marked. On the third night, I heard something outside. It was late. I was lying in bed, half asleep. At first, I thought it was an animal. I heard crunching sounds, like someone walking over dry leaves. I stayed still and listened. The sound stopped, then started again. It wasn't loud, but it was steady. I got up and looked through the window. It was pitch dark outside, and I couldn't see anything. I didn't have any outdoor lights. I told myself it was a raccoon or something like that. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. I didn't see anything unusual. No paw prints, no trash scattered. Still, something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there. I tried to ignore it. That afternoon, I walked down to the lake with my fishing rod. I cast a few lines, but I wasn't really trying to catch anything. I just liked being near the water. The lake was calm, surrounded by tall pines. The dock was old and creaked under my weight. I sat there for a while, legs dangling over the edge. When I came back to the cabin, I noticed the front door was open. Not wide open, just cracked. I was sure I had closed it. I stopped walking and stared at it for a long time. There was no one around. I stood still, listening. The woods were quiet again. I slowly walked up to the door and pushed it open. Everything inside looked the same. My bag was still on the bed, and nothing was moved or taken. I tried to tell myself maybe I forgot to close it all the way, or maybe the wind blew it open. But the door was heavy, and it latched tight. It didn't swing open easily. That night, I locked the door and dragged a chair in front of it. I kept a kitchen knife beside my bed. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept hearing things. Soft thuds, rustling sounds outside. Every time I opened my eyes, I stared at the door, expecting to see it move. Didn't, but the sounds didn't stop. At some point, I got up and looked through the window again. I still couldn't see anything. It was too dark, and the trees were too close. The next morning, I decided I needed to know what was going on. I walked around the cabin, looking closely at the ground. The earth was soft in places, still wet from rain earlier in the week. Near the back of the cabin, I saw something that made my stomach twist. Footprints. Not boot prints, not animal prints. Bare feet. Human. They weren't mine. They led from the trees to the back wall of the cabin, then stopped. I followed them for a bit, but they faded fast in the drier patches of dirt. I stood there, staring into the woods, feeling completely exposed. I had no phone, no way to call anyone. I thought about leaving, but it was a long drive back, and I didn't even know if I'd make it to town before nightfall. I told myself maybe it was a hiker, maybe someone just passed by and didn't mean anything. I started locking the door every time I left the cabin. I kept the knife on me now. I didn't walk the trail anymore. I stayed close to the porch and never turned my back to the woods for long. The peace I felt at the start of the trip was gone. I felt watched. I felt hunted. 2 nights later, I woke up to the sound of tapping. It was light, like fingers on wood. I didn't move. I just listened. It was coming from the window to the left of the bed. I kept my eyes open and listened. Tap, tap, tap. Then silence. Then it moved. The tapping was now at the back window near the kitchen. Then it stopped again. My mouth was dry. I gripped the knife so hard my hand started to cramp. I stayed frozen until morning. As soon as it got light outside, I packed everything into my bag. I didn't bother with breakfast. I didn't even change clothes. I just grabbed my stuff and opened the door. The front of the cabin was fine. Nothing unusual. I walked to my car and popped the trunk to toss my bag inside. Then I saw it. On the back window of the car, drawn into the dust, was a handprint. It was big, too big to be mine, too long, and it wasn't smudged, like someone brushed against it. It was clear and clean, like someone pressed their hand into the glass slowly and on purpose. I got in the car and started driving. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. Even then, I didn't feel safe. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see something step out of the woods. I drove for hours, not thinking about anything else. When I finally got back to the city, I called the rental site and reported what happened. They said no one else was supposed to be up there. The nearest property was miles away. They apologized and said they'd send someone to check the place. I didn't tell them everything. I didn't mention the handprint or the barefoot tracks. I just said I heard noises and didn't feel safe. That was enough for them. Took me weeks to feel normal again. I couldn't sleep without a light on. Every noise made me jump. I started keeping a knife beside my bed at home too. I didn't go on walks. I didn't even like looking out windows at night. I still don't know what was out there. I don't know who was tapping or why someone would be watching a cabin in the woods in the middle of nowhere. I try not to think about it, but sometimes it comes back, especially when it's quiet, when the air feels too still. One thing I do know is I'll never go to a place that remote again. Not alone. Not without a way to call for help. I wanted silence, and I got it. But I also found something else out there. Something that was watching. Something that never said a word. And somehow that was worse than any noise. It was late October when I drove up to the cabin. The weather had just started turning cold, and the days were getting shorter. I had found the place listed on a small cabin rental site that didn't get much traffic. The photos were old and grainy, but something about the isolation appealed to me. I was tired, mentally and physically drained. A break from work, people, and the constant noise of the city sounded like exactly what I needed. The cabin was located deep in the hills of northern Montana. It was a 4-hour drive from the closest town, and for the last hour and a half of it, there was no cell signal. The gravel road that led to the cabin was overgrown in spots, with weeds and small branches brushing against the sides of my SUV. The trees got thicker as I got closer, tall pines mixed with a few dying birches. By the time I finally pulled up, it was just after 4 p.m., and the sky was already beginning to dim. The cabin itself looked older than I expected. The wood was dark and weathered, and the windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the front porch creaked under my boots when I stepped onto it. But it was quiet, so quiet. No cars, no people, no hum of electronics. Just the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of old wood. Inside, the place smelled like dry wood and dust. There was a small living room with a stone fireplace, a couple of worn armchairs, and a low wooden table. The kitchen was just a corner with an old stove, a mini fridge, and a sink that pumped water from a tank out back. There was one bedroom and a small bathroom with a compost toilet and a shower stall fed by a propane-heated tank. I unpacked quickly and lit a fire. There was a chill in the air even inside. I made a simple dinner and sat by the fireplace, feeling the warmth sink into my bones. There was no TV, no radio, and no internet. I had brought a few books and I picked one up, but I couldn't concentrate. My thoughts were too loud. I kept staring at the fire, letting my mind wander. When I went to bed that night, the quiet was unsettling. My ears kept searching for sound. At home, I had grown used to traffic, sirens, neighbors upstairs. Here there was nothing. I heard the wind in the trees and the occasional groan of the cabin settling. But that was it. I kept the fire going and left the door to the bedroom cracked open, just so I could see the light. The next morning, I got up early. I boiled some water on the stove for coffee and ate a protein bar. I wanted to explore a bit, so I packed a small bag and headed out on foot. There was a faded trail behind the cabin that wound through the woods. The air was crisp and smelled like pine and damp earth. My boots crunched on dead leaves as I walked. About an hour in, I stopped to rest by a fallen tree. I hadn't seen or heard anything except a few birds. No planes, no distant sounds of cars, just the deep, empty silence of the forest. I should have felt peaceful, but there was something about it that felt off. Like the forest was watching, like the trees themselves had eyes. I kept walking but didn't go too far. I didn't want to get lost. I turned back after another 30 minutes and followed the trail back to the cabin. The door was just as I'd left it. Everything inside was untouched. But when I walked into the kitchen, I noticed a strange smell, like wet dirt. I figured I must have tracked it in, so I took off my boots and left them by the door. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard footsteps outside. I kept telling myself it was probably deer or other wildlife, but the steps sounded too heavy, too careful. At around 2 a.m., I got up and looked out the front window, but I couldn't see anything except the porch and the trees beyond. I turned on the outside light, but it didn't reach very far. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. I checked the windows and the door. Nothing looked out of place. But when I walked around the back, I noticed something in the dirt. Tracks, not boot prints, bare feet, long, narrow, and deep, like whoever made them was heavy. The prints led from the trees to the back of the cabin, then disappeared. I felt a pit in my stomach. Maybe someone had come through during the night. Maybe some crazy hermit or someone living off the grid. I didn't know. I went back inside and locked the door. I kept the fire going and tried to read, but I couldn't concentrate. That afternoon, it started raining. The sound on the roof was oddly calming. I sat by the window and watched the trees sway. But as the sky got darker, I started to feel that same unease, like I wasn't alone. I kept checking the windows. Every shadow looked like it was moving. Every creak of the wood made me sit up. That night, the power went out. The lights were already dim, powered by a small generator, but now it was completely black. I had candles and I lit a few, placing them around the room. I tried not to panic. I told myself the generator must have run out of fuel, even though the tank had been full. I sat with my back to the wall, facing the front door. I kept a fire going, but I didn't sleep. Every sound felt amplified. I could hear something out there, not just the wind, breathing. Slow, steady breathing right outside the wall. I held my breath, waiting for it to go away. Eventually, it did. The next morning, I went out to check the generator. The fuel line had been cut, clean, not chewed by animals, cut. I stared at it for a long time, trying to understand what was happening. Someone was out there, someone who didn't want me there, someone who knew how to move quietly. I packed my bag. I didn't care about the rest of my stuff. I just wanted to leave. But when I got in the SUV, the battery was dead. I hadn't left anything on. I checked the hood, and the cables had been pulled. Not just loose, pulled out and cut. Panic set in. I was stuck. No signal, no power, no way to leave. I grabbed my flashlight, a knife from the kitchen, and locked myself inside. I pushed the armchair against the door and sat there, heart pounding. The day dragged on. Every little noise felt like a threat. The wind, the trees, the rain. Everything felt hostile. That night, I didn't light the fire. I didn't want to give away my position. I sat in the dark, listening. I didn't sleep. Just before dawn, I heard it again. Footsteps on the porch. Then nothing. Just silence. In the morning, I opened the door slowly. On the porch, something had been left behind. A deer skull, clean, white, placed carefully in the center of the doormat. I closed the door and didn't open it again. I waited, I ate my protein bars, drank from the water tank. Days passed. I stopped counting. I stopped sleeping. I just sat there, waiting for something to happen. Then one morning, I heard a helicopter, faint but real. I ran outside, waving my arms, shouting, passed over once, then circled back. A search team had been sent after I missed my check-in. They landed half a mile away, cleared the area, and helped me out. I didn't tell them everything, just that my car broke down and I lost power. I didn't mention the footsteps, the skull, the breathing. When we got back to town, they towed the SUV. The mechanic confirmed the cables had been cut. The fuel line on the generator too. I never went back for my stuff. I haven't been back to the woods since. Sometimes at night, I still hear the breathing. Quiet, steady, just outside the wall. It was late October when I drove up into the mountains to stay at the old cabin my uncle left me after he passed away. The place sat in the middle of thick pine woods, far off from any town or paved road. I had to drive my truck across gravel and dirt for nearly an hour after leaving the main road. I went up there alone. I needed a break from the noise, stress, and constant pressure of everything back home. My job, my phone, the internet, all of it, it was too much. I thought being alone for a week or two might clear my head. I brought supplies, food, bottled water, camping gear just in case, and even some firewood, though the cabin had plenty stacked up already. The place looked worn but solid. It was a small wooden cabin, built sometime in the 60s with one bedroom, a kitchen, and a small bathroom in the back. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, and no cell signal. The trees wrapped around the building like a cocoon, making it feel hidden, safe, and totally cut off. That first night, I sat on the front porch with a beer and listened to the wind moving through the trees. I felt peaceful. Things started to feel different the second night. It was a little colder, and the air felt heavier. Around midnight, I was in bed under layers of thick blankets when I heard something crunching in the woods outside. It sounded like footsteps, slow and careful. I froze. I tried to tell myself it was a deer or maybe a bear, but something about the rhythm didn't sit right. It would crunch forward a few steps, stop, then crunch again. I stayed completely still, just listening. Eventually, the sound faded, and I must have drifted off. In the morning, I walked around the cabin and found what looked like old boot prints in the dirt, about 30 feet from the front door. They were deep and wide, and the pattern didn't match any boots I had. I tried to shake it off. On the third night, I locked the door and closed the blinds before bed. I was trying not to let my imagination take over, but I kept thinking about those prints. Around 2 a.m., I woke up because I heard something on the porch. I stayed quiet and listened. There was a soft creaking, like weight shifting on the wooden boards. Then a knock. Just one, slow knock on the front door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Another knock. Just one. Then silence. I stayed awake for hours, holding the hunting knife I kept under the bed. I never saw anything when I finally looked out the window. The woods were dark, silent again. By day 4, I was starting to feel jumpy. Every crack in the wood, every gust of wind, made me flinch. I kept checking the windows. I kept locking and relocking the door. I considered packing up and leaving, but I told myself I was being paranoid. That afternoon, I went for a short hike. I figured maybe moving around would help me relax. I walked a mile or so out into the forest, following a path that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There were no signs, no markers, just a thin trail that twisted through the trees. After about 30 minutes, I came across something that stopped me cold. It was a small shack, old, rotting, and nearly hidden by the underbrush. The wood was gray and falling apart, and the roof sagged on one side. I had never seen it before on any map, and my uncle had never mentioned it. I stood there for a while, staring at it. Then I turned and walked back. I didn't want to go near it. Something about it felt wrong. That night was worse than all the others. I barely slept. I kept hearing movement outside, branches snapping, dry leaves being stepped on. Once, I heard something brush against the back wall of the cabin, like someone dragging their hand along the wood. I didn't go outside. I stayed in bed with the knife in one hand and a flashlight in the other. At sunrise, I walked the perimeter again. This time I found more prints. Fresh ones, in the dirt and mud behind the cabin. They circled the building. I was done pretending it was just animals or the wind. Someone was out there. I didn't pack up right away. I should have. But part of me didn't want to be chased out by fear. Instead, I took the axe from the tool shed and kept it next to the door. I stayed inside most of the day, listening, waiting. I tried to read. I tried to eat. But my body was tense the whole time. That evening, just before dark, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. It was the sound of my own truck engine starting. I ran out the door, barefoot, heart pounding. My truck was parked where I left it, maybe 50 feet from the cabin near the edge of the clearing. The engine was running. The headlights were on, but nobody was in the driver's seat. I stood frozen for a moment. Then I slowly walked up to it, looking around, half expecting someone to jump out from the trees. But no one did. The keys were in the ignition, even though I had them inside the cabin. I shut off the engine and took the keys. I walked back, locked the door again, and this time I moved a piece of furniture in front of it. That night, I barely blinked. I kept the fire going. I kept the axe in my lap. I didn't even go to the bathroom. The next morning, I packed everything. I loaded the truck and got ready to leave. But before I did, I made one last mistake. I decided to check out the shack again. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I'd find answers. Maybe I thought it would help me understand what was happening. I walked back down the trail, this time with the axe in hand. When I got there, the shack door was open. Inside, the air was damp and smelled like mold and rust. There was an old metal bed frame, a few broken tools, and a stack of clothes in one corner. Men's clothes, jeans, jackets, boots, all in different sizes, all old and dirty. In the far corner was a pile of old ID cards. I picked one up. It had a name and photo. The photo looked like a man in his 30s, smiling. The name meant nothing to me. I picked up another. Different name, different face. I checked 5 or 6 more. All men, all different, all gone. That's when I saw the trapdoor. It was half covered by the bed frame. I cleared it and pulled it open. The smell that came out made me gag. Rot and dirt. There was a wooden ladder leading down. I didn't climb it. I dropped the axe and ran. I didn't stop until I was in my truck, driving as fast as the road would let me. I didn't look back. I didn't sleep until I was home. I called the local sheriff's office. I told them about the shack, the IDs, the trapdoor. They went out and found it. They found more than I saw. Bones, clothing, tools, notebooks. They said it looked like someone had been living out there for years. They didn't find anyone, though. I sold the cabin 2 weeks later. I haven't been back. I never found out who was out there or how they got my truck keys or how long they had been watching me. I don't want to know. What I do know is that if I had stayed one more night, I might not be here to write this. Sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I still hear that single knock. Just one. It started with a break. I had been working nonstop for years, and I finally reached a point where I could take some time off. No emails, no phones, no noise. Just me and the woods. I booked a small cabin deep in the northern hills, several hours from the nearest town. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be far away from everything. I found this place through an old friend who had used it a year ago. It was simple. 1 room, a wood stove, a bed, a small bathroom, and a little kitchen area. No TV, no internet, no cell service, just trees and hills for miles. The drive took longer than I expected. The last hour was over rough dirt roads. I passed maybe 2 houses and then nothing but forest. When I pulled up to the cabin, I felt a strange kind of relief, like I had truly left everything behind. The air was colder than I thought it would be, and the wind had that sharp edge to it that hinted at coming snow. I unloaded my supplies. Canned food, dry snacks, bottled water, some firewood, a few tools and clothes. I was planning to stay a full week. The first 2 days were peaceful. I slept in, made simple meals, and read old books I had brought. I went for long walks on the trails near the cabin. Everything felt calm, and the silence was better than I had imagined. It wasn't total silence, though. There were birds in the morning, wind through the trees during the day, and sometimes the sound of branches snapping under snow or small animals. By the third night, things started to feel different. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps. I thought maybe it was a deer or something like that, but the steps were steady, slow, and on 2 feet. Not fast like a running animal. Not the erratic noise of raccoons or something digging around. It sounded like someone walking, right outside. I didn't move. I laid in bed and listened. The sound came from the backside of the cabin, then around to the side where the small porch was. Then it stopped. I waited, holding my breath. No knock, no voice, just quiet. I finally got up and looked out the window. I saw nothing, just trees and snow. I told myself maybe it was my imagination. Maybe I was dreaming and half awake. The next day, I checked around the cabin. There were faint tracks in the snow that went around the building. Too big for a small animal. Too even and spaced out to be four-legged. I stared at them for a long time. They circled the cabin once and then disappeared into the woods. I thought about leaving, but it felt silly to run away just because of some tracks. I told myself it was probably a hiker who got lost and wandered close during the night. I even convinced myself I had imagined the footsteps. I tried to push it from my mind. I didn't go on any long walks that day. I stayed near the cabin, kept the fire going, and sharpened the hatchet I brought, just in case. That night, I went to bed with the fire still burning and the hatchet next to me. At some point that night, I woke up again. No footsteps this time, but I felt something. It's hard to explain, like being watched. I laid there for a long time, heart racing, listening to nothing. But the feeling didn't go away. It was like the air itself was heavy. I got up, turned on the lantern, and walked around the cabin. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake that feeling. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I decided I was going to leave early. I had 4 more days planned, but I didn't want to stay. I packed most of my stuff and loaded the car. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. Not even a click. The battery was dead. I opened the hood and checked the cables. Everything looked fine. The battery wasn't that old. It made no sense. There was no signal on my phone either. I was stuck. I stayed calm at first. I had food. I had water. I had tools and firewood. I told myself I just needed to wait for someone to come by. Maybe another hiker. Maybe a ranger. I tried to spend the day reading and staying busy, but I kept checking the window. I felt like something was nearby, not close enough to see, but close enough to feel. That night, the footsteps came back. They were louder this time, slower, more confident. They walked around the cabin twice, then stopped at the front door. I sat on the floor, clutching the hatchet. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I waited. After a few minutes, I heard something scratch lightly on the wooden wall. Just one scrape, then nothing. Hours passed before I moved again. The next day, I found more tracks. Clearer this time. They weren't boot prints. They were bare feet. Long toes, wide soles. The steps were too clean to be made by someone wearing shoes. It was freezing outside. No one would be barefoot out there. Not for long. I tried to start the car again, but nothing happened. I checked the battery again. It looked fine. I didn't understand. I thought about walking out, but I had no idea which direction the nearest house was. And with the snow, it would take hours, maybe days. I stayed. That evening, I boarded up the windows. I stacked firewood by the door and kept the hatchet in my hand. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, listening. Around midnight, the sounds returned. Footsteps. This time, there were more of them. I counted at least 2 sets. They circled the cabin, walked up to the windows, scratched at the wood, and then stopped. I waited. Nothing. Hours passed. The next day was the worst. I found handprints on the windows. Dirty, smudged, greasy-looking handprints. They were low, like someone had been crouching. One was pressed flat against the glass, fingers splayed. The others were streaks, like someone had dragged their hand across slowly. I kept the fire going all day. I didn't leave the cabin. I didn't eat much. I drank water and sat by the window with the hatchet. My whole body was tense. Every shadow made me flinch. I started hearing noises that weren't there. Creaks, whispers, breathing. But when I really listened, there was nothing. That night, they came again. This time, they didn't just walk around. They knocked. Slow, steady knocks. Not loud, but clear. I sat frozen, staring at the door. The knocks continued for a full minute, then stopped, then came back again on the other side of the cabin. I couldn't understand how they moved so quietly. The snow should have crunched. The deck should have creaked. But there was nothing but the sound of those steady knocks. The next morning, I snapped. I ran out with the hatchet, screaming into the woods. I didn't care who or what was out there. I yelled until my throat hurt. I saw nothing, just trees and cold air. But I didn't feel better. I felt worse, like I had shown them I was scared. That night, I didn't light a fire. I turned off all the lanterns and sat in the dark. I thought maybe they would leave me alone if they thought the cabin was empty. I waited in the cold, wrapped in blankets, listening. The footsteps came again. This time, they didn't stop. They walked back and forth, side to side, around and around. Then I heard breathing, right outside the window. Slow, heavy breathing. I didn't move. I stayed like that until dawn. When the sun came up, I finally looked out the window. The tracks were everywhere, all around the cabin. Some were bare feet. Some were long, strange, and not fully human, like twisted versions of footprints. I knew then I couldn't stay. I had to leave. I packed a bag with the basics: food, water, hatchet, flashlight, matches. I left a note inside the cabin in case someone found it. Then I started walking. I picked the road I had come in on and followed it. I didn't run. I didn't look back. I walked for hours. Every now and then I heard sounds behind me, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. I didn't stop. By afternoon, I saw a small cabin in the distance. Not the one I came from, a different one. A ranger station, maybe. I ran the last part. It was empty, but there was a landline inside. I called for help. They sent someone in a snowmobile. I didn't say much, just that my car broke down and I had been stuck. A few days later, I went back with a tow truck to get my car. The cabin looked the same, but the windows were broken. The door was wide open. Inside, everything had been torn apart, like someone had gone through every drawer, every box, every bag. My note was gone. The tow truck guy looked nervous. He asked if I wanted to file a report. I said no. I just wanted to leave. We towed the car back to town. I never went back. That was 3 years ago. I still think about it sometimes. I still hear footsteps when I'm alone at night. I never figured out who or what was out there, but it was real. It was all real. And I learned one thing from it. When something doesn't feel right, trust it. Don't wait. Don't stay. Just go. I was 34 when I rented that cabin deep in the Oregon woods. I needed time away from everything: work, noise, people. I just finished a 5-year project with the construction company I worked for, and I was burnt out. Completely. My hands were always sore. My back hurt in the mornings, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd slept through the night without waking up in a sweat. I'd found the listing online. It wasn't even on Airbnb or one of the big rental sites. It was buried on a forum post about quiet retreats, linked to a plain HTML webpage with one photo of a wooden cabin and 2 sentences. Asterisk, no internet, no neighbors, $400 a week. Asterisk, that was it. No reviews, no fancy descriptions, nothing. But the photo of the cabin looked solid. 1 floor, old wooden siding, tucked behind tall evergreens and a narrow dirt driveway. It was what I needed. I emailed the guy, wired him the money, and he gave me the directions. There wasn't even a pin location, just a series of landmarks to follow and a gate code for the chained fence that marked the entrance to the property. I packed light, just a duffel bag with clothes, a box of canned food, a hunting knife I kept for safety, a flashlight, and some camping gear in case the cabin was worse than the photo showed. I threw it all in the trunk of my old Camry and made the 7-hour drive north from Bend. It was early May, still cold in the mornings, but most of the snow had melted. The last few miles of the road were slow, muddy, narrow, and full of potholes. My car bottomed out twice, and I had to get out and clear a fallen branch once, but I eventually found the chained gate and put in the code. The cabin was farther in than I thought, maybe another half-mile after the gate. Trees closed in tight on both sides. No tire tracks, no signs of anyone having been there recently. I rolled down my window and listened. Nothing, just whined through the trees and the occasional bird call. When I finally pulled up in front of the cabin, I felt it immediately. That silence, the kind that presses in on you, the kind you only get way out in the middle of nowhere. No buzz from power lines, no hum of traffic in the distance, just stillness. The cabin itself looked even better in person. Weathered but sturdy. The porch had a few loose boards, but the door opened smoothly with the key I'd been given. Inside was one main room with a bed against the wall, a small kitchen, a wood-burning stove, and a table with 2 chairs. There was a small bathroom too, just a toilet and a cold water tap in the sink. No shower, but I hadn't expected one. It was cleaner than I thought it would be. Dusty, but not dirty. Someone had been there not too long ago. I brought in my stuff and lit a few candles. The power didn't work, but again, I hadn't expected it to. I set my things down, sat on the edge of the bed, and just breathed for a while. The quiet felt good. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed. I read old magazines that had been left behind, took short walks through the woods, and cooked simple meals over the fire outside. I had a solid routine. Wake up at sunrise, chop wood, boil water, clean up, and then just sit and think. There was no cell signal, no distractions. I started sleeping better almost immediately, but on the 3rd day, I noticed the shed. It was behind the cabin, down a short slope maybe 40 feet from the back wall. The trees hid it from view unless you walked out and looked for it. I don't know how I missed it earlier. It was small, maybe 8 feet wide and 10 feet long, with a rusted metal roof and thick, mossy walls. The door was wooden and bolted shut with a heavy-duty padlock. I stood in front of it for a long time. It looked old, but not abandoned. The lock was new. No rust, no wear. The kind you'd see at a hardware store, fresh out of the package. And there were footprints in the dirt outside. Not old ones. Deep, like someone had been standing there recently. One set boots like mine, but smaller. I didn't try to open it. I figured maybe the owner stored tools or something down there. Maybe hunting gear. I didn't think much of it at first. That night, though, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things. Not loud noises, just soft scraping sounds, like wood shifting against wood. Once I sat up because I was sure I heard something thump against the wall outside. But when I went out with the flashlight, I didn't see anything. No wind, no animals nearby. Just the same silence, but heavier. The next morning, I walked back to the shed. The footprints were gone, washed out by dew maybe, but the door looked different. The padlock was still there, but the wooden frame around the door had new marks on it. Small scratches, like something had been pressed or dragged across it. Again, I didn't touch it. I told myself not to make it a big deal. I spent most of that day away from the cabin. Hiked a little, found a stream, sat on a boulder and watched the water pass for over an hour. But when I got back, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The front door was open, just slightly, maybe an inch. I knew I'd locked it. I always did. I even remembered pulling the handle tight before heading out. I checked the inside, nothing was missing, but my bag had been moved. Not searched or dumped out, just moved from the bed to the floor. I stood there for maybe 20 minutes, frozen, trying to figure out if I'd done it myself. If I was tired, if I was just overthinking. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the fire going and sat in the chair with the hunting knife in my lap. I kept the flashlight close. Around 2 in the morning, I heard movement outside again. Closer this time. Definite footsteps. 1 or 2 and then nothing. I didn't go out. I just sat there, trying not to breathe too loud. By morning, I felt half crazy. I packed everything back in the car and decided I was leaving a day early. I didn't care about losing the money. I just wanted to be out of there. But the car wouldn't start. Battery was dead, completely drained. It made one weak clicking sound and then gave up. I popped the hood. No visible damage, but something felt off. The battery cable was slightly loose, like someone had been in there. I tightened it and tried again. Nothing. I felt the panic build. My hands started shaking. I went back inside and grabbed my flashlight and a can of beans and decided I'd walk. I had a map. I knew the road back to the gate. Maybe 4 miles. I could do that. But as soon as I opened the front door, I stopped cold. The shed door was open. Not wide, just enough to see darkness inside. The padlock was lying in the dirt. I froze, stared at it, then slowly stepped forward. I should have turned around. But I walked toward it, holding the flashlight like a weapon. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. When I got to the shed, I leaned close and shined the light inside. It was empty, just dirt floor, old wooden beams, and a metal hook hanging from the ceiling. No tools, no gear, nothing. But the floor had marks, fresh ones, like something had been dragged across it. Heavy, and there was a smell, not strong, but sharp, metallic, like rust, or blood. I backed away and ran. I didn't stop until I got to the gate, but the code didn't work. I tried it 3 times, the one I'd used before. Nothing. It beeped and stayed locked. The chain was tight, thick metal links I couldn't cut without tools. I walked back to the car half in a daze, slept with the knife in my hand that night, barricaded the door with the table and a chair. I didn't hear anything that night, but I barely slept. In the morning, I tried the car again. It started, just like that, like nothing had happened. I didn't waste a second. I drove out, stopped at the gate, and tried the code again. Still didn't work. But this time I saw something I hadn't before. A second keypad, hidden under a loose metal panel. I pressed a random sequence, nothing. Then I tried the original code again, but on this second pad. Clicked. The chain loosened. The gate opened. I drove through without looking back. I reported it to the sheriff's department in the next town. Gave them the website, the directions, everything. A deputy said they'd check it out. 2 weeks later, I called for an update. They said the gate was gone. The road ended in brush. No sign of a cabin. No sign of a shed. Just forest. I checked the site again. It was gone too. Page not found. I still don't know what I walked into. Maybe someone's hunting cabin. Maybe something worse. I've thought about it a lot. The fresh lock, the marks, the car, the shed, the smell. Whatever was going on there, it was meant to be hidden, and I wasn't supposed to find it. I don't go into the woods anymore. I used to enjoy it. The fresh air, the calm silence, the crunch of leaves under my boots. I liked the way it made me feel away from everything. But that changed one weekend in early October 2 years ago. I've never talked much about what happened. It's one of those stories people would laugh at if they weren't there. But it was real. It happened. And I can still see the trees when I close my eyes. Back then, I was living in northern Minnesota. My job was remote, so I could work from anywhere, and I had a thing for cabins. I'd spend weekends off the grid, staying in small rentals tucked far into the forest. That October, I found one on a listing site. It looked like it hadn't been updated since the 90s. Wood paneling, old furniture, no Wi-Fi, but that's what I liked. It was about 3 hours north of Duluth, near the Canadian border, completely secluded. I booked it for 4 nights. I brought everything I thought I'd need: canned food, firewood, a propane stove, a hunting knife, a basic first aid kit, and a battery-powered lantern. The cabin didn't have electricity, and I was fine with that. I brought a few books, and my phone was mostly for emergencies. I didn't plan to talk to anyone. That's kind of how I've always been. I drove up early Thursday morning and got there around noon. The road was rough, especially the last 5 miles, which was just a single narrow dirt path winding through thick trees. I had to slow to a crawl more than once because of branches or ruts. When I pulled up to the cabin, I didn't see another structure anywhere around. No other people. No vehicles, just thick pine trees and the sound of the wind moving through them. The cabin itself was smaller than it looked in the photos. One room with a bed, a small table, a wood stove, and a door that led to a small outhouse out back. The air smelled like dry wood and cold earth. Inside, it was about 50 degrees. I unpacked quickly, set up my food in a cooler on the floor, and got the fire going. The wood stove took a while to warm up the place, but it gave the inside a nice, dry heat once it got going. The first day was uneventful. I walked a small trail that looped around the back of the property and down to a dried-out creek bed. I didn't see any animals except squirrels. I sat on a log for a while and just listened to the quiet. That was something I loved. The absence of cars, phones, voices. The kind of silence that lets you hear your own thoughts. That night, I went to bed early. It was cold, and I'd packed a heavy sleeping bag. The only light in the cabin came from the dying glow of the stove. I remember drifting off easily, feeling relaxed in the kind of way you only feel when you're completely alone and far from people. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I don't know what time it was. The fire had gone out. The cabin was pitch black. The kind of black you only get in the woods where there's no light pollution. I heard something outside. It sounded like a single thump, then silence. My first thought was a branch falling, but I stayed still, waiting. After about 30 seconds, I heard something else, like footsteps, slow, crunching leaves and twigs. Not an animal scurrying, but deliberate steps. I held my breath. I couldn't see anything from where I lay. The only window faced the front porch, and the moon wasn't out. I lay there listening for 5 minutes. The steps came and went, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. At one point, I swear I heard breathing just outside the window. Not fast or loud, just the slow, steady sound of breath. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Eventually, it stopped. I must have stayed frozen for an hour before I fell back asleep. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. No tracks, nothing obvious. The ground was mostly dry pine needles, which don't hold footprints well. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe even a bear. Still, I couldn't shake the way it sounded so human. I spent the second day chopping wood. The air was sharp and cold, and I wanted to stay warm through the night. I gathered more logs from behind the cabin and split them until my arms ached. I took breaks, sitting on the porch, watching the trees. I kept glancing at the edge of the woods. The tree was thick, too thick to see into. I started getting the feeling I was being watched. I don't mean that in a dramatic way. It wasn't like I saw anything, but I couldn't shake it. The hairs on my neck kept standing up, and I kept looking back over my shoulder every time I walked to the outhouse or gathered wood. That night, I stayed up later. I didn't want to fall asleep too early. I kept the fire going and read by lantern light. Around midnight, I turned everything off and got into bed. I tried to sleep, but my ears were tuned to every noise. Then I heard it again, a thump, same as the night before. I sat up. My heart started pounding. Then came the footsteps, slow again, but this time they circled the cabin. I counted them 1, 2, pause, 3, pause, 4. They stopped near the back wall. I sat there gripping my hunting knife, listening. My mouth was dry, and then something scraped against the wall. Not a hard scratch, more like something brushing it, like fabric or skin. Then nothing. I stayed awake until dawn, the fire burning low, my back against the wall, knife in hand. When the sun rose, I went outside. I checked the walls. Again, no marks, no prints, nothing. But I was starting to feel like I wasn't alone out there. The third day, I didn't go far. I stuck close to the cabin. I boiled water, made instant coffee, and forced myself to eat. I read. I tried to distract myself. But every time the wind shifted or a branch creaked, I jumped. That afternoon, I walked to the edge of the woods behind the cabin. I decided to see how deep it went. I walked in about 50 yards. The trees were tighter back there, less light, no trails. I turned around to head back. That's when I saw it. A tree, tall and dead, had something hanging on it. At first I thought it was bark, but as I got closer, I saw it was cloth. A piece of flannel, red and black, tied to a branch. It was frayed and dirty, like it had been there a while. I scanned the ground. About 10 feet from the tree was a small pile of rocks. Not a natural pile, stacked deliberately, 6 or 7 medium-sized stones, arranged in a triangle. My stomach turned. I felt something in me go cold. I turned around and walked straight back to the cabin. That night was the worst. I didn't sleep. I kept the fire going high and sat in the chair with the lantern on. The silence outside was deep, too deep. Around 2 a.m., I heard the steps again. But this time, they didn't stop. They came up the porch. I heard the wood creak. Then silence. Then, soft as anything, the door handle moved. Jiggled. Slowly. Not like someone trying to break in. Just testing it. I didn't breathe. My knife was already in my hand. I thought about yelling, but that would have meant whatever or whoever was out there would know I was definitely inside. And alone. The handle stopped moving. Then I heard one single knock. Quiet, slow knock. One. Then nothing. I sat there until the sun rose. That morning, I packed everything. I didn't even eat. I threw my gear in the car and started driving back down that dirt road. Took me nearly an hour to reach the main road, and I didn't stop once. When I got home, I took a long shower and sat in my apartment without moving for hours. Later that week, I called the listing site and flagged the cabin. I didn't explain much, just said I had safety concerns and that it shouldn't be listed without inspection. I didn't hear back. I never looked it up again. A few months passed. I tried to forget it, but one night, curiosity got the better of me. I went online and searched for cabins in that part of Minnesota. I found a blog post by a hiker who had gone off-trail up there and found something odd. Piles of rocks, tree markings, and flannel scraps tied to branches. He'd thought it was a hunting marker at first, until he kept finding more. He stopped posting after that one entry. I never went into the woods again after that. I don't think it was an animal. I don't think it was a drifter either. There was no sign anyone lived out there. No camp, no trash, no gear. But someone or something was there, and they didn't want me staying in that cabin. What scared me the most wasn't the sounds or the footsteps or the knock on the door. It was the feeling I got when I stood in those trees and looked at that piece of flannel on the branch. The feeling that I wasn't just being watched, but studied. That someone was waiting to see what I'd do. And maybe, if I'd stayed one more night, they would have stopped waiting. I've stayed in hotels ever since. It started with a simple idea. I wanted to get away. My job was stressing me out, and the city noise had been making my chest feel tight for weeks. Every car horn, every siren, every stranger brushing past me on the sidewalk made me feel like I was going to explode. I was tired of fast food, tired of screens, tired of other people. I booked a cabin up north. Not in a popular resort or ski town, this place was more isolated. It was listed on a small site that only dealt with backcountry rentals. The pictures were decent. The outside of the cabin was wooden, dark brown, almost black in some areas. The roof looked slanted and worn, with snow piled high on top. It had a fireplace, a small kitchen, a bed, and not much else. It looked like the kind of place where no one would bother me. That's what I wanted. I packed enough food for a week, mostly canned stuff, snacks, and a few vacuum-packed meals I could heat on the stovetop. I took water jugs, a power bank, a first aid kit, warm clothes, and a thick sleeping bag just in case. I also brought a folding shovel, a headlamp, and a knife, more out of habit than need. I didn't expect anything to go wrong. The drive took most of the day. The farther I got from the city, the more the snow piled up on the side of the road. By the time I got off the main highway and onto a narrow road through the woods, my tires were crunching through fresh snow. Trees crowded both sides. Their branches sagged low under the weight of snow. I had to drive slow, but I didn't mind. It felt like I was peeling away layers of noise with every mile. By the time I got to the cabin, the sky was gray, and daylight was starting to fade. I parked the car a little off the trail and carried my supplies up the short hill to the cabin. The air was cold and dry. Every breath stung my lungs a bit, but it was cleaner than anything I'd breathed in months. The cabin was colder than I expected inside, but it was clean. No dust, no smell, just quiet and cold. I got the fireplace going using the dry logs stacked against the wall. After the fire caught, the cabin slowly started to warm up. I set my stuff down, changed into thicker clothes, and heated a small meal on the stove. I ate sitting on the edge of the bed, watching the fire, feeling my body start to relax for the first time in weeks. The first night was calm. I read for a while by lantern light, listened to the wind outside, and then finally slipped into sleep. It wasn't perfect sleep, but it was better than what I was used to. The wind outside made the windows creak sometimes, but it wasn't creepy, just natural. The next day, I went out early to walk a bit. I followed a narrow trail that led down a slope and through thick trees. The snow was deeper than it looked, and I had to be careful not to sink in past my knees. I didn't see any animal tracks, just my own from when I arrived. That didn't seem strange. Not many animals were active in that kind of cold. I spent most of the day just walking, breathing, clearing my head. When I got back, I chopped a bit of wood, boiled some snow just to have extra water, and sat by the fire again. Felt good. I started to think that maybe I'd stay longer than a week. But the third night, something changed. It started with a sound. I was half asleep, the fire still burning low, and I heard something outside. It was faint, like a thud or a crunch. I thought maybe a chunk of snow fell from the roof. I didn't get up, but then it happened again, louder this time. Not like snow falling, more like something stepping on packed snow. A slow, heavy crunch. I sat up, heart beating faster. I stayed still and listened. A few seconds later, another crunch. Then another. Closer now. It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the trees. I stood up and moved to the window quietly. I pushed the curtain aside and looked out, but it was dark. I couldn't see anything. No movement, just snow and trees and shadows. I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't want to be seen if someone was out there. I waited by the window for almost 10 minutes, listening. Nothing. Whatever it was either gone or standing still. I slowly backed away from the window, took the knife out of my pack, and kept it by my side as I laid back down. I didn't sleep well that night. In the morning, I went outside and looked around the cabin. I circled the whole thing. No prints. Nothing in the snow at all. That made no sense. The snow was fresh. If anything had walked by, it would have left a mark. I thought maybe I imagined the sound. Maybe the wood shifted or the wind knocked something over. I didn't know. I tried not to think about it. That day passed like the others. I hiked, read, cooked, tried to enjoy the quiet, but something had changed. I was more alert. My ears were tuned to every creak of the trees and pop of the firewood. I couldn't relax completely. That night, it got worse. I heard it again. Not once, not twice. It was constant. Started around midnight. The sound of footsteps outside. Not fast or loud, just slow, deliberate crunching through the snow. I turned off the lantern and sat by the window, my headlamp in my lap but turned off. I sat there for at least an hour, staring into the dark, waiting for a shape or a shadow to move between the trees. Nothing came into view, but the sounds didn't stop. At one point, it circled the cabin. I followed it from window to window, careful not to be seen. But every time I looked out, I saw nothing. The sound stopped just before dawn. I must have fallen asleep sitting up because the next thing I remember is waking to the sound of wind outside and light coming through the window. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. There were tracks this time, footprints, deep, spaced apart like someone walking slow. They circled the entire cabin, twice. Then they led off into the woods, down the trail I had used. I followed them for a few minutes. The prints were uneven, like whoever made them had a limp or was dragging one foot. I didn't follow them far. I didn't want to. That day, I kept the knife on me the whole time. I stopped hiking. I stayed inside with the fire going and kept checking the windows. Around noon, it started to snow again, covering the prints. By late afternoon, they were gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat in the corner of the cabin, near the fire, staring at the windows. I kept thinking I would see a face pressed against the glass or hear the door rattle, but nothing happened. In the morning, I decided I was leaving early. I packed everything, got dressed, and went out to the car. When I got to it, I stopped cold. The driver's side door was open, just a little, not wide, not broken, just cracked open like someone had pulled it and then stopped. I hadn't touched it since I arrived. I know I locked it. Inside, nothing was taken. Nothing was broken. But in the passenger seat, there was a small clump of snow. Not melted, like it had just been placed there. A single muddy footprint was on the floor mat. That was enough. I started the car and backed it out as fast as I could without sliding off the trail. I didn't stop to look back at the cabin. I didn't even stop for food or gas until I was back in the city, surrounded by people and noise and traffic. I never figured out who or what it was. There were no police reports, no warnings. I didn't tell the rental site, and I never left a review. I just wanted to forget about it. For a while, I did. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that sound in my head. That slow, dragging crunch in the snow, like someone walking just outside, circling, waiting. It was early October when I decided to take a break from everything and head out to a remote cabin deep in the mountains of northern Idaho. I had been burned out from work, tired of the city noise, and just mentally exhausted. I needed quiet, I needed space, and I needed to feel like I wasn't being watched or talked to or texted every minute of the day. I rented the cabin online. It wasn't part of a campground or some vacation spot. It was just an old hunting cabin, owned by some guy who only used it in winter. He offered it cheap since it had no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and no TV. That was exactly what I was looking for. I drove out early in the morning. The cabin was almost 5 hours from where I lived. The last 2 hours of the drive were nothing but gravel roads winding through the mountains. It was just forest for miles. No towns, no gas stations, not even a ranger station. The GPS dropped out before I even hit the gravel road, but the owner had given good directions. After a while, I started passing old rusted signs and broken down wooden fences, but no houses, just more trees. I remember how the air smelled. Cold pine, dry earth, and something else I couldn't name. Maybe old wood. When I finally got to the cabin, it looked even more remote than I had imagined. It was tucked into a clearing at the edge of a slope, surrounded by tall fir trees. The place looked weathered, like it had survived 100 storms. The wood was dark and dry. The windows were small, almost like they were meant to keep the cold out more than let the light in. There was a small front porch with an old rocking chair that groaned in the wind. The door creaked when I opened it. Inside, the place smelled like dust and wood smoke. The owner had left some canned food, matches, and firewood. There was an old iron stove in the corner and a single bed pushed against the wall under a small window. I unpacked, lit the stove, and just sat there for a while. That first night was peaceful, quiet in a way I hadn't felt in years. Couldn't even hear the wind, just the occasional crack of the wood cooling in the stove. I went to bed early and slept harder than I had in months. The second day, I explored around the cabin. There was an old trail leading into the woods behind it. I followed it for a bit but didn't go far. The forest was dense, and the sun barely reached the ground. I saw old animal tracks, maybe deer or elk. I found a tree stand about a mile out. It was old, barely holding together. A rusted thermos still sat on the wooden platform, left there probably years ago. I took a few pictures with my phone even though there was no signal. It was just something to do. That evening, I sat out on the porch. The wind had picked up, and the sky had gone gray. I could hear the trees creaking. Around dusk, I noticed something strange. The forest had gone quiet. No birds, no wind, no rustling, just silence. It lasted maybe 5 or 6 minutes, and then the wind came back and everything felt normal again. I shook it off. On the third night, I woke up suddenly, not because of a sound, but because of the absence of one. The stove had gone cold, which was normal, but the quiet wasn't. I sat up in bed and just listened. The wind was gone again. No trees moving, no creaks, no sounds at all. I got up and looked out the window. I couldn't see anything. Just black. I thought maybe the weather had changed or maybe it was foggy. I decided to go outside and check. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door. The air outside was still. No wind, no smell. My breath puffed out in clouds. I walked out a few steps into the clearing and shone the flashlight around. The light hit the trees, but they looked different. Almost too still, like a picture. I started to feel uncomfortable, like I was being watched. I told myself it was just being out in the woods alone. My brain playing tricks. I went back inside and locked the door. The next morning I noticed something odd. Footprints in the frost. They weren't mine. They came from the tree line and stopped just short of the porch. They were deep and spaced apart, like whoever made them had a heavy stride. I followed them for a while, but they just stopped. No turn, no backtrack. Just gone. I didn't know what to think. Maybe a hunter? But no tire tracks, no other signs of people. That day I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't feel right wandering far. I chopped some firewood, cleaned up the place a bit, cooked some food. As the day wore on, the wind picked up again. Around late afternoon, I heard something in the woods. A snap, then another. Too slow for an animal. I stood on the porch and stared into the trees, but saw nothing. It happened again just after dark. Snap, pause, crack. It was close, maybe 50 feet. I lit the lantern and sat near the window watching, but nothing ever showed. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. On the porch was an old hatchet. Not mine. The blade was rusted, the handle cracked. It hadn't been there before. I checked all my tools, nothing missing. The hatchet looked like it had been left in the rain for years. I picked it up with a towel and placed it in the firewood box. I couldn't explain it. That day, I decided to hike back to the main gravel road. It was a few miles, but I needed to feel like I wasn't completely cut off. Just walking helped clear my head. The road was empty just like before. No cars, no signs of people. I stayed out until early evening and headed back just before sunset. As I approached the cabin, I noticed something. The rocking chair on the porch was turned to face the woods. I had left it facing the door. Small thing, but it bothered me. That night, I blocked the door with a chair and brought the hatchet inside. I didn't light the stove. I didn't want any light showing from the windows. I sat in the corner and waited. I don't know what I expected. Nothing happened for hours. Then, just before 3 a.m., I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, circling the cabin. Crunch, crunch, crunch. They stopped by the back wall. Then silence. I waited. Nothing else. I didn't sleep at all. In the morning, I found marks on the back wall. Scratches, like someone had dragged something metal across the wood. Long, straight lines. Too high for an animal. I packed my bag and decided I was leaving. I didn't care if I lost the rest of the rental money. I threw everything into the truck and started the engine. It wouldn't turn over. Battery was dead. I hadn't left the lights on. I checked the cables, everything looked fine. It didn't make sense. I tried again. Nothing. I had no choice. I grabbed my pack, took the extra water and food I had, and started walking back to the main road. It was cold and cloudy. Every sound made me jump. Branches breaking, leaves rustling. I felt like I was being followed. But when I turned, nothing. Just the woods. I made it to the gravel road by early afternoon. Still no cars. I walked for hours. Finally, just as it started getting dark, I saw headlights. A forestry truck. The guy gave me a ride into town. I didn't say much, just thanked him and got dropped off near a motel. I never went back for the truck. I called a tow service from town and gave them the coordinates. When they got there 2 days later, the truck was fine. Battery fully charged. Started on the first try, but the cabin door was open. The chair I had used to block it was broken in half. They asked if I wanted them to bring anything back. I told them to leave it all. I didn't want anything from that place. That was 8 months ago. I still think about it sometimes. The silence, the footsteps, the hatchet. It wasn't a ghost story. It wasn't some wild creature. It was something real, something human, someone out there watching. I don't camp alone anymore. I don't go anywhere without cell service. And I don't ignore the feeling when the woods go quiet, because now I know that silence means something is out there, and it's not always nature. Sometimes it's just someone waiting. It was about 10 years ago. I went with a group of college friends during a winter break. It was an old wooden cabin deep in the hills of northern Idaho, somewhere outside a small logging town that barely had cell reception even back then. The guy who invited us, Tom, said his uncle used to hunt elk up there and left the cabin to him. It wasn't fancy, just 4 walls, a roof, and a fireplace. But it was real quiet and the kind of place you didn't forget. We only stayed 2 nights back then, drank too much, lost power once, and got snowed in briefly. The kind of rough weekend that felt adventurous when you're 20, but you move on from it. Still, something about that place always stuck in my head. Maybe because it felt untouched, like the woods around it didn't care if you were there or not. You could scream and no one would ever hear. Not because it was haunted or magical or anything like that, just because it was isolated in a way most places aren't anymore. Years passed, and I started working as a freelance videographer. Weddings, hunting trips, corporate events, whatever paid the bills. Eventually, I started a small YouTube channel doing solo travel and survival type videos. It wasn't a huge hit, but I built a small following. I camped in the desert, slept in the back of a van, hiked through Appalachia. One day, out of nowhere, I thought about that cabin again. I wasn't even sure where it was exactly, but after digging around through old photos and talking to a couple of old friends, I figured it out. With Tom out of the country and apparently having no interest in it anymore, I decided I'd go check it out alone. Maybe film myself spending 3 nights up there for the channel. Old school log cabin. No cell signal. Just firewood, canned food, and a tripod. Simple living. That was the idea, at least. I drove up in early October. The colors in the hills had already started to turn, and I figured I'd beat the snow by a few weeks. My car was a beat-up Subaru that could handle rough roads, and it needed to because the last 5 miles were nothing but rutted dirt. By the time I parked, my knuckles were white from gripping the wheel. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, letting the silence wrap around me. No traffic, no wind, no birds even, just that dry, cold quiet. The cabin looked just like I remembered it. Same slanted tin roof, same split logs stacked to the side. One small window on each side, glass foggy with age. The front door hung a little crooked, and the whole place leaned just enough to make you notice. I stepped out of the car, stretched, and looked around. The forest was dense in all directions. No trails, no visible neighbors, just pine trees and dead leaves. I opened the door and stepped inside. The inside smelled like dust, old wood, and mice. There was a fireplace made from river stones, a table with 3 mismatched chairs, and a couple of cots in the back room. Someone had left behind an axe, a rusty kettle, and a pile of old hunting magazines in a milk crate. I spent the first hour clearing cobwebs, sweeping out debris, and checking for rodent nests. Nothing too bad, though I did find a couple of dead mice near the windowsill. I set up my camera and filmed a short intro. Day 1, I said. Just got to the cabin. Going to spend 3 nights out here. No phone, no people, just me and the woods. The first day went smooth. I gathered firewood from behind the cabin, cut some kindling, and got a small fire going before dusk. I boiled some water, ate a can of beans, and watched the sunset from the front step. The stars came out early and bright, the kind of night sky you only see far from towns. I went inside, locked the door, and lay in the cot with my sleeping bag zipped up tight. The silence was strange at first. I kept thinking I heard small noises, the rustle of a branch, the crack of something outside, but I told myself it was just the wind or animals. By midnight, I finally fell asleep. Sometime in the early morning, I woke up cold. The fire had died down to just red coals, and the cabin felt like a refrigerator. I pulled the bag tighter around me and tried to sleep again, but my ears caught something. A soft thump, then another. Not loud, just dull, like someone dropping a boot on the porch outside. I held my breath and waited. Nothing. After a few minutes, I figured it was something falling from a tree or maybe an animal stepping on the porch. The wind could knock things loose. The roof could shift. Old places made noise. I tried not to overthink it and finally drifted off again. The next morning, I made coffee on the wood stove and walked around the cabin filming for the channel. I noticed boot prints in the dirt near the porch. They were mine, I thought, but something about them bothered me. The pattern didn't match the soles of my hiking boots. Mine had deep treads with a cross pattern. These were more like flat work boots. Faded tread, narrower than mine too. I crouched and stared at them for a long time. I told myself maybe they were from years ago. Maybe a hunter. Maybe Tom had come up here a year or two back. Or maybe I just didn't remember what my own boots looked like in the dirt. I stepped over them and tried not to think about it. Day 2 went slower. The novelty of being out there wore off. I spent most of the morning fixing a draft in the window, then went for a short walk through the woods behind the cabin. I didn't go far, just enough to feel the quiet settle on me again. The forest was thick. Fallen trees, moss-covered stumps, and a carpet of pine needles. I filmed a few short clips and then returned before sunset. That night, I cooked rice and jerky on the stove and sat by the fire with a book. I kept the axe nearby, just in case. Around 10, I stepped outside to use the bathroom, just the edge of the woods, since there was no real toilet. When I came back, I noticed something strange. The axe was no longer leaning by the fireplace. It was on the floor closer to the door, like it had been nudged. I froze. The door had been closed. I was only outside for a minute. I checked the locks. Nothing broken. The latch still in place. I picked up the axe and looked around the cabin again. Nothing else had changed. No sign anyone had been inside. Still, it left a feeling in my stomach I couldn't shake. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound made me tense. The creak of the rafters, the pop of the firewood, a scratching sound near the floorboards that I told myself was mice. At some point near dawn, I finally passed out. When I woke up, the front door was open. I sat up fast, heart racing. The cold air rushed in through the open door like a river. The fire had gone out completely. I grabbed the axe and stood still for a long time, just listening. Nothing, just the low hum of wind and the groan of the old wood. I stepped slowly to the door. The latch wasn't broken. It looked like it had just been opened. I looked out at the dirt path. New footprints, definitely not mine, coming from the tree line. Flat-soled boots again. I didn't film anything that morning. I spent it walking a circle around the cabin, axe in hand, checking for signs of who might have come close. No food missing, no gear moved, just the door opened and footprints in the dirt. Whoever it was, they didn't take anything. That made it worse. I didn't want to panic, but I packed my bag, just the essentials. My wallet, my camera, a flashlight, and the axe. I left the rest and hiked down the dirt road until I found a spot with weak cell signal. After 20 minutes of trying, I got a text out to a friend, just saying where I was and that I'd be back the next day. I thought about leaving early, but something stubborn kept me there. I didn't want to be scared off. Maybe it was a logger. Maybe someone thought the cabin was abandoned. Or maybe they were just messing with me. Either way, I told myself I'd stay one more night, just one. That afternoon, I went into the woods again, this time deeper. I made a wide circle around the cabin, looking for campsites or signs of someone living nearby. Nothing. No trash, no tarps, no trail markers. Just endless pine. I stayed close after that. I cooked early and kept the fire going strong. I even barricaded the front door with one of the chairs. Not because I thought it would stop anyone, but maybe slow them down. That night was the worst. It started with a noise around 1 in the morning. A dragging sound just outside the window. Slow and steady, like someone pulling something heavy across the ground. I didn't move. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, hand on the axe. Then came a knock. Not loud, just 3 slow taps on the wall beside the window. Not even on the door. Then silence again. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour. When I finally worked up the nerve, I grabbed the flashlight, flipped it on, and aimed it at the window. Nothing. just condensation and the reflection of my own face. But in the morning, I found something behind the cabin, a rope, coiled and half buried under some leaves. And next to it, a piece of metal pipe maybe 3 feet long. Both were clean, not rusted like they'd been there for years. I didn't wait any longer. It started when I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the mountains of Montana. I had been working nonstop for over a year without a break, and I needed to get away from people, phones, traffic, and everything else that came with the city. The idea of spending time alone in the quiet of nature sounded perfect. I booked a small, remote cabin through a private listing. It wasn't on any of the major rental sites. I found it on a forum where someone talked about how peaceful and isolated it was. That's what I was looking for. Just me, some basic supplies, and nothing else. The cabin was a good 5 hours away from any major town. The road to get there turned from pavement to gravel and eventually into dirt. It twisted and climbed into the mountains until my GPS stopped working. I had printed out directions, which helped, but even then I missed a turn and had to backtrack. I didn't see a single other vehicle once I passed the last gas station an hour and a half back. I finally found the clearing where the cabin sat, surrounded by thick trees on all sides. It was smaller than I expected. A single room with a small kitchen area, a bed, a wood stove, and a table. There was a bathroom attached in the back, and a small shed about 20 feet behind the cabin. No running water. I had brought jugs and a portable filter. There was no cell service and no electricity, only a few solar-powered lanterns left by the owner. I felt excited as I stepped out of the truck. The air smelled like pine, and it was so quiet it felt like the trees themselves were holding their breath. The first 2 days went well. I chopped firewood, read books, cooked simple meals on a small propane stove, and took long walks along the trails I found weaving through the forest. The quiet was intense. At night, I would hear the wind in the trees and the occasional animal rustling in the underbrush. It made me a little nervous, but I reminded myself this was just nature. On the 3rd day, things started to feel different. It began with a feeling that someone was watching me. I was collecting wood behind the cabin when I suddenly froze. I didn't hear anything, but I could feel it, that pressure, like eyes on my back. I turned slowly, heart thudding. Nothing was there. Just the shed and trees. I told myself I was being paranoid. Later that night, while I was inside reading, I heard a knock. It wasn't loud, just a single, slow knock on the front door. I stared at the door for a long time. No one should be out here. I hadn't seen a car, person, or even footprints anywhere near the place since I arrived. I stood up, heart pounding in my ears. I didn't open the door. I didn't even go near it. I turned off the lantern and sat in the dark, listening. Nothing followed. No more knocks. Eventually, I went to bed but didn't sleep well. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to look for footprints or any sign someone had been there. Nothing. The dirt in front of the steps was undisturbed. I checked all around the shed too. Nothing there either. It bothered me all day. I couldn't focus. I didn't go for my usual walk. I stayed close to the cabin. That night, I made sure everything was locked up. I pushed the table against the door and kept the hatchet I used for splitting wood beside the bed. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were slow, crunching footsteps right outside the cabin. I held my breath and listened. Whoever it was circled the cabin once. Then nothing, just silence. I waited for what felt like hours before falling asleep again. In the morning, I searched again. This time, I found something. A single boot print behind the cabin. It was faint but definitely not mine. The tread was different. My boots had a zigzag pattern. This was a plain sole with a rounded heel. It sent a chill through me. Someone had been out here, maybe even watching me. I told myself it was a hunter or a lost hiker, but the feeling in my gut said otherwise. I thought about leaving, but I had no signal to call anyone and didn't want to drive the dangerous mountain roads in a rush. I figured I would stay one more night and leave first thing in the morning. That afternoon, I kept hearing twigs snapping in the trees. I tried to convince myself it was just deer or squirrels, but the sound was deliberate, like someone pacing. I stayed inside, curtains drawn. As the sun went down, I kept all the lanterns off. I didn't want to be seen. I sat on the floor behind the bed, gripping the hatchet. Felt like I was in some kind of trap. My own cabin felt like a cage. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard the shed door creak open. It wasn't wind. The door was heavy and didn't swing open on its own. I hadn't touched the shed since I arrived. I didn't even know if it was locked. I waited, frozen. A few minutes later, I heard something dragging, something heavy scraping across the dirt. Then footsteps. They stopped outside the cabin. I held my breath. Then came a slow knock. Same as before. One single knock. I stayed still. Then another knock, louder this time. I didn't move. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I waited in silence. I must have stayed like that for 2 hours before I finally looked out the window. Nothing there. I didn't sleep again. At dawn, I packed everything. I didn't care if I forgot something. I needed to leave. I loaded the truck fast and took one last look at the cabin. That's when I saw the shed door was still wide open. I walked over carefully, hatchet in hand. Inside the shed was an old workbench, a few broken tools, and something that made my skin crawl. There were fresh ropes laid out neatly, a small roll of duct tape, an old rusty saw, and in the corner, a sleeping bag that wasn't mine. Someone had been staying there, watching me, maybe for days. I didn't wait around. I jumped in the truck and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the main road hours later. When I finally got to a gas station with service, I called the sheriff. I gave him the directions and told him everything I saw. He sounded concerned and promised to send someone to check it out. A few days later, I got a call. The sheriff said they found the cabin, but the shed was empty. No sleeping bag, no tools, nothing. The cabin showed signs someone had stayed there, but they couldn't find any footprints. No prints on the doors, nothing that pointed to another person. He said the owner hadn't rented the cabin to anyone else for over 6 months. I was supposed to be the first person in a while. I asked if they could track anyone down. He said it was unlikely, too remote, too easy for someone to vanish into the woods. I never went back. I don't even go hiking alone anymore. I still think about those nights, the slow knocks, the footsteps, the shed. Someone was there, watching, waiting, maybe planning something worse. I don't know what would have happened if I had opened that door. I'm glad I didn't. I went up that mountain to find peace, but I found something else entirely, and it changed how I see the woods forever. It was the second week of October when I finally decided to take a break from everything. Work was driving me mad. The constant noise of the city never seemed to stop, and my phone felt like a leash I couldn't escape from. So I packed up, grabbed supplies from the store, and rented a remote cabin up north that I found on an old website. It was cheap, and the pictures looked decent enough. It sat next to a lake, surrounded by thick woods, and the listing said it had no Wi-Fi, no reception, no TV. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive took nearly 9 hours. I passed through smaller and smaller towns until I was on a long dirt road barely wide enough for my car. It was already evening by the time I pulled up in front of the cabin. The place was quiet. I couldn't even hear birds or insects. The trees stood tall around the cabin like they were watching it. The lake was about 30 yards behind the cabin, its water still and dark. There was a small, rotting dock and a metal rowboat turned upside down on the shore. The cabin itself looked older than the pictures made it seem. The wood was faded and cracked in places. The porch steps sagged when I walked up them, and the door creaked loud enough to make me wince. Inside, everything was basic old furniture, a wood-burning stove, and a mattress on a creaky metal frame. There was no fridge, just a cooler that I had to fill with ice from a gas station 2 hours back. I set my food supplies in the cooler, unpacked my clothes, and lit a fire in the stove. That first night, I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around me, drinking coffee from my metal mug. The silence was so heavy it felt like pressure in my ears. I couldn't remember the last time I heard so much nothing. It should have been peaceful, but it didn't feel that way. The trees never moved. The lake never rippled. I kept turning around like I was expecting something to be standing behind me. I told myself I was just not used to this kind of silence. I went to bed early that night. There was only one room in the cabin, so I laid down on the bed with my flashlight close and a hatchet under the mattress. I didn't sleep well. I woke up several times, feeling like something had startled me, but I never heard anything. Every time I got up and looked through the window, everything was still. It was like the world was frozen. The next day, I chopped some firewood and walked down to the lake. I tried fishing, but I didn't catch anything. The water was so still it looked like glass. There weren't even ripples from fish or bugs. That was weird. I had been to plenty of lakes, and even the quietest ones had some movement. I sat at the edge for a long time, just staring out, but it started to make me feel uneasy, so I walked back. I explored the woods a bit in the afternoon. I brought a small backpack with snacks, water, and a knife just in case. The trees were dense, and the deeper I went, the darker it got. I marked trees with my knife so I wouldn't get lost. A couple of times I thought I heard crunching footsteps behind me, but every time I stopped and looked, there was nothing. I chalked it up to animals or maybe just my nerves. When I got back to the cabin, I saw something odd. There were fresh footprints near the porch. They weren't mine. I checked. My boots left a very specific tread, and these prints were larger and deeper. Whoever made them had heavier boots, and it looked like they had circled the cabin. I looked around but didn't see anyone. I stood there for a long time listening, but the woods stayed quiet. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going and stayed up with the hatchet in my lap. I stared out the window waiting for movement, but nothing happened. When the sun finally came up, I felt sick from lack of sleep. That morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for more prints. They were gone. The dirt had been disturbed like someone had swept them away. That made no sense. There was no wind strong enough to do that, and even if there was, it wouldn't sweep them so clean. I started feeling paranoid. I thought maybe I was imagining things, maybe the isolation was messing with my head. I decided to hike deeper into the woods to clear my mind. I packed better this time, more food, compass, flashlight, and a flare gun I had in my car's emergency kit. I went much further than before, following the same marks I had left on the trees. After about 2 hours of walking, I noticed something that made me stop. There was a structure up ahead, partly hidden behind thick trees. It looked like an old shed or maybe a hunting blind. I approached it slowly, heart pounding. It was made of rotting wood, and one of the walls was falling apart. Inside, there was a single chair, and around it, dozens of empty food cans, animal bones, and old blankets. It looked like someone had been living there recently. I backed away and turned to leave, but I noticed a fresh boot print right next to mine. Someone had been standing behind me very recently. I didn't run, but I walked fast. I didn't care about the trail markings. I just wanted to get back to the cabin. I got lost twice. The trees all looked the same, and I started panicking. I finally found the lake again and followed it back to the cabin. When I got inside, I locked the door and pushed the couch against it. I sat in the corner of the room with the hatchet, shaking. The sun was already going down. I hadn't realized how long I had been out there. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to give away my position. I sat in the dark, watching the window, listening. At one point, I heard soft footsteps on the porch, then the sound of someone trying the door handle, then silence. I stayed up the entire night again. When morning came, I packed everything I could fit into my bag, grabbed the keys, and ran to my car. I didn't even lock the door behind me. I started the engine and drove until I hit the highway. I didn't stop once. When I got back to the city, I called the owner of the cabin, but the number was disconnected. The website I booked from was gone. I checked satellite maps, and I couldn't find the lake or the cabin. It was like it had never been there. I didn't report it to the police. I didn't think they'd believe me, and I wasn't even sure what I'd report. No crime was committed, but I knew what I felt out there. Someone had been watching me. Someone had been living out in those woods, and I had stumbled into their territory. I haven't gone camping since then. I don't hike anymore. I keep the curtains closed at night and check the locks twice before bed. I don't tell many people about what happened because most would think I'm exaggerating. But every now and then, I dream about that lake, still and dark, and I wake up feeling like someone is still out there, walking circles around me, waiting for the right moment. I was 34 when I decided to take a week off alone in a cabin up in the mountains near Libby, Montana. I'd been working nonstop for nearly 8 months straight, 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, and my body was just done. My mind too. I didn't want a beach, didn't want hotels, didn't want to be around anyone. Just silence. I had no kids, no wife, just a job I didn't want to think about, and an apartment that started to feel more like a storage closet than a home. I found the cabin through a man I knew from a hiking club. It wasn't listed online. He told me it belonged to his uncle who no longer used it. Said it was way up in the timberline and didn't have cell service, but it had a stove, firewood, and a big water tank. That sounded good enough. I paid him cash. He gave me printed directions that involved turning off a logging road and driving for 20 minutes up a trail that looked like it hadn't seen tires in years. The day I arrived was cold. It was late October and the wind had a real bite. I drove my old SUV loaded with food, extra gas, a backup battery pack, and a pump-action shotgun. I wasn't planning to hunt or anything. I just didn't like the idea of being that far out with nothing. Bears were still active, and you never know who you'll run into in places where law doesn't stretch. The drive up that final trail was rough. My SUV barely handled it. Thick pine trees clawed at the sides of the car, and in places the path was barely wide enough to squeeze through. I hit a big rock under my bumper more than once, but eventually I reached a clearing. The cabin sat off-center in the tree line, perched on a slight hill with a view to the west, where the land dropped into steep valleys. From the clearing, I could see maybe 50 miles of forested ridges, all empty. The cabin was small, just one main room, a bathroom, and a loft. Wood walls, tin roof, old-style glass windows. Smelled like dried sap, dust, and smoke. There was a cast iron stove in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, a counter with a propane burner, and a metal-framed bed with a thin mattress. A pile of chopped firewood was stacked beside the stove, and more was out back under a blue tarp. I unpacked everything slowly, set the food on shelves, checked the water tank, and made sure the pipe to the sink worked. It did. There was no shower, just a tin basin and a bucket, but I didn't mind. I had planned for that. The first 2 days were great. I sat outside and watched the sunset. I chopped some more wood. I walked around a bit and saw deer tracks and what looked like a bear print near the edge of the clearing, half in frozen mud. I wasn't worried though. I'd done hikes through glacier before. I kept my shotgun loaded but out of the way. At night, I read a paperback and slept like a rock. Then things started to get weird. It began on the 3rd night. I was lying in bed when I heard what sounded like a branch snapping behind the cabin. Not a light crack, but a deep, heavy one, like something large had stepped on it. I froze, staring at the ceiling. Then came another one, then silence. I waited a full minute, heart thumping, ears straining, but there was nothing after that. Eventually, I drifted off. In the morning, I walked around the cabin. I expected to see tracks, but the ground was frozen solid in the shaded parts and scattered with dry needles in others. Nothing stood out. Still, something didn't feel right. That afternoon, I went farther out, down the hill about a quarter mile. There was a rocky stream there that the directions mentioned. I wanted to try fishing. I didn't catch anything, but while I was there, I saw something strange. About 30 feet upstream, wedged between 2 rocks, there was an old, beat-up boot. Looked like a work boot. Black, leather, maybe size 11. I got close but didn't touch it. It had a few scratches and looked waterlogged. No sign of the other one. No bones, no clothes, just the boot. I left it alone and went back to the cabin. That night, I locked the front door for the first time. The door had one of those simple slide bolts, nothing special. I also leaned the hatchet against the inside wall just in case. The shotgun was already near the bed. Around 2 a.m., I woke up. Something had tapped the window. I sat up slowly. I thought maybe a tree branch was brushing the glass. But there was no wind. Everything was dead quiet. I didn't turn on my flashlight at first. I just sat still. I heard it again. A soft tap, 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 like a finger or a stick. Same rhythm. Then silence. Then again. 3 taps. Slow and deliberate. I reached for the shotgun and stood up. I moved to the wall near the window and slowly leaned over to peek. I didn't see anyone. I opened the door and stepped out. My flashlight beam cut across the clearing. There was nothing. The trees swayed gently, but the air was still. No sound at all. No animals. Not even an owl. I walked the perimeter, checked behind the cabin, even walked out to the edge of the clearing and looked into the trees. Nothing. But I didn't sleep after that. The next morning I found prints. Boot prints. They were faint, but I saw them. Right under the window where I heard the tapping. The weird thing was they didn't come from the forest. They came from behind the cabin. Then they circled around and stopped under the window. Then nothing. No trail leading away. Just gone. I stayed inside most of that day. I kept the shotgun close. Around noon, I noticed the boot I saw by the creek was gone. I hadn't touched it. It had been stuck between 2 rocks. But now it was just gone. I walked over there, checked all around, and saw the indent where it had been, but it wasn't anywhere nearby. I started to get that buzzing feeling in my head, like something was wrong and I couldn't put my finger on it. I tried to eat but couldn't keep anything down. That evening I sat in the chair and watched the forest for hours. At some point I must have dozed off. I woke up to footsteps on the front porch. Not the light kind from a raccoon or a deer. Heavy, slow, deliberate footsteps. Then they stopped. I didn't move. I barely breathed. A long moment passed. Then came the tapping again. 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. Then silence. I waited a long time. I don't know how long, but my legs had gone numb by the time I moved again. I grabbed the flashlight, racked the shotgun quietly, and kicked the door open, sweeping the light across the porch. No one. But this time there was something else. On the porch, where I had dropped my boots earlier in the day, someone had tied the laces together and hung them from the railing like a noose. I hadn't done that. I never tie them together. My heart thudded so hard I felt it in my teeth. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against the wall, watching the door. By morning, I made up my mind to leave. I packed my gear fast, filled the tank from the spare gas, and got ready to backtrack down that trail. But when I stepped outside, I stopped cold. There were more footprints, at least 4 different sets. Not all boots either. Some were bare feet. I swear, bare human feet. In October, in the cold, and not small either. They went around the cabin in loops. Some stopped by the back window. Others led to the tree lean. Some crossed over each other like they'd been pacing. I started the engine and left. Fast, but it wasn't over. About 10 minutes down the trail, I had to stop. A tree had fallen across the path. Big one too. Old pine. Looked like it hadn't fallen naturally, it was cut. I could see the saw marks, but it wasn't there when I came up. I got out and tried to move it. No use. It was too thick and long. That's when I noticed the smell. Rotting meat. Heavy. Like a dead deer left in the sun. I looked around but didn't see any carcass. Just that awful smell. Then I heard movement. Up in the trees, about 30 yards off. Crunching leaves. Then a soft whistle. Not a bird. Not natural. A 2-tone whistle. Low-high. Repeated. Then silence again. I grabbed my axe from the back and started hacking at the smaller limbs on the tree, enough to drive around it. Took me 20 minutes. Every few minutes, I'd hear another noise. A crack, a rustle, that same whistle, always the same rhythm. I finally got through and drove like hell back to the main logging road. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. Back in town, I didn't say anything. I returned the cabin key to the guy who lent it to me, told him thanks. I didn't tell him what happened. I didn't want to seem crazy, but I knew I'd never go back up there. That was 4 years ago. Last year, I looked up missing persons reports in Lincoln County, Montana. There were more than a few. Hikers, hunters, campers. One guy went missing near Libby in 2019. They found his car but never found him. Another man disappeared from a trail only 5 miles from the area where that cabin sits. No sign, no explanation. I still don't know who or what was up there with me. It wasn't ghosts or monsters. It was people, or something close to it. People who live in the woods. People who don't want to be found. People who watch. Sometimes I needed to get away from everything. Work, noise, the city, even people. After months of constant pressure at my job and hardly any sleep, I decided to take a week off and rent a cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. No phone signal, no neighbors, no traffic, just me and silence. The kind of silence you forget exists when you live in the city too long. The cabin I found was old but looked solid in the listing. It sat alone about 15 miles down a dirt road off the main highway. The owner lived out of state and barely used it anymore. It had no internet, no TV, no fancy modern stuff. Just a basic generator for power, a wood stove for heat, and a big chest freezer that ran on propane. It was perfect for what I wanted. I got there late in the afternoon. The place sat surrounded by thick pine trees. The driveway was more like a trail, and I had to drive slowly so I wouldn't destroy my tires on the rocks. The clearing around the cabin was maybe half the size of a football field. Beyond that, it was just forest. I stepped out of my car and took a deep breath. The air was cool, fresh, and had that sharp pine scent you never really smell unless you're far away from towns. The cabin itself looked worn but sturdy. The logs were dark from age, and the roof had a few patches, but it didn't look like it leaked. There was a single door in the front, 2 windows on each side, and a tiny porch with a broken swing hanging crookedly. I unlocked the door and walked in. Smelled old inside, but not bad. Just wood and dust and maybe a little mildew. The floor creaked under my boots. There was a small kitchen area to the left with a gas stove, a sink, and some shelves with canned goods. A table sat in the middle with 2 chairs. To the right, there was a living area with a couch, a rocking chair, and a black wood stove. The bedroom was behind a half wall, just a bed and a dresser. Nothing fancy. I opened the windows to let in some air, then went out back to start the generator. It fired up on the second pull. The lights inside flickered on, and I heard the fridge and freezer hum to life. The propane tanks were full. Everything seemed fine. For the first 2 days, I did almost nothing. I read, chopped a little firewood, cooked some simple meals, and walked around the woods near the cabin. I didn't go far. I wasn't trying to explore or get lost. I just wanted to be still for once. I slept better those 2 nights than I had in months. On the 3rd morning, things started to feel off. I woke up early, before sunrise. I'm not sure why. It wasn't a noise that woke me, at least none that I remembered. But I had that strange, heavy feeling in my chest. The kind you get when you feel like something isn't right, even if you can't explain what. I lay there in bed, listening to the woods outside. It was quiet, not silent. There were distant birds and the occasional creak of the trees, but it felt too still, like everything was holding its breath. I got up and made coffee. As I drank it, I walked outside to look around. The air was colder than usual. My breath fogged up fast. I stood on the porch and scanned the treeline. Nothing moved. No deer, no squirrels, no birds flitting around. It was weird, but I told myself it was just early. Later that day, I went around the cabin to check things. I don't know why, I just felt like I should. Everything was fine until I got to the small shed out back. It wasn't much, just a little structure with tools and a couple trash cans inside. The door was slightly open. I didn't remember leaving it that way. I stepped closer and saw scratch marks on the edge of the door. They weren't from an animal. These were long and deep, like from a tool. Pry bar maybe, or a screwdriver. I opened the door slowly. Inside, things were a bit out of place. One of the shovels leaned against the wrong wall. The small gas can that had been tucked in the corner was now in the middle of the floor. But nothing was missing. I stood there for a while just staring. It made no sense. I hadn't used the shed at all since I got there, and no one else was supposed to be out here. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things outside. Light cracks like footsteps on dry sticks. Then silence. Then one more. Just one. Then nothing again. It wasn't constant, but every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something. I sat up and listened for hours, but I never saw anything out the windows. In the morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. About 15 feet from the back door, I found something that stopped me cold. A footprint. Bare. Human. It was in a patch of soft dirt near the edge of the clearing. Just one print, facing the cabin. It was fresh. The edges were clean. The heel had dug in deep. Whoever it was hadn't worn shoes. There were no other prints around it. Just the one. I looked in every direction. Nothing. But the trees were thick and dark beyond the clearing. Someone could have been out there, standing still, just watching me. I went back inside and locked the door. I even nailed a piece of wood across the back door just in case. That night was worse. I kept the lights off and sat in the dark, just listening. At one point, around midnight, I heard something scrape across the back wall. Slow and steady. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The noise stopped. Then it came again, this time on the sidewall right under the window. Another slow scrape. Then a tap. Just one. I didn't sleep at all. In the morning, I went outside with the hatchet I kept by the door. The wood on the back wall had long scratch marks. Same on the side, like someone dragging a long nail or blade. I checked the trees again, but there was no one. No more footprints. No paths. Just forest. That's when I decided I needed to check the whole cabin. Really check it. I started in the living area. Nothing under the couch. Nothing behind the stove. I moved to the bedroom, pulled the dresser out, nothing. Opened the closet, empty. Then I remembered the big chest freezer. It sat in the corner of the kitchen, half full of ice and some frozen meat the owner left. I hadn't opened it yet. I had no reason to, but I kept thinking about the power running to it and the fact that it was large enough to fit a grown man. I walked over and opened the lid. At first, it just looked like frozen meat. Steaks, a few old packages wrapped in butcher paper. But then I noticed something underneath, half buried in frost. Plastic. Black plastic like a garbage bag. I moved the meat aside and pulled at the bag. It was stiff from the cold. I worked it up slowly. When I got it open, I saw the top of a head. Hair. Skin. Frozen. I dropped the bag and backed away fast. There was a body in the freezer. A man. Curled up, stuffed in like meat. His skin was blue-white from the cold. His eyes were closed. His face looked like he'd been dead for a while. I stood there shaking, trying to breathe. I didn't know what to do. My phone had no signal. The road back to the highway was long, and the thought of driving through those woods with someone possibly out there watching me made my skin crawl. But I couldn't stay. I packed my bag fast. I kept the hatchet in my hand the whole time. I turned off the generator, grabbed my keys, and went out the front door. I didn't lock it. I didn't care. I just wanted to leave. As I walked to my car, I saw something new. In the dirt behind my car, there were 2 more barefoot prints. Fresh, deep. They led away into the trees. I got in the car and locked the doors. The engine started. I backed out fast and turned down the trail. For the next 30 minutes, I didn't see anything. Just trees and dust. But every time I looked in the mirror, I half expected someone to be standing in the road behind me. I made it to the highway, then drove until I found a small town with a sheriff's station. I went in, told them everything. They sent deputies to the cabin that afternoon. Later, they called me, said the body in the freezer had been there for months, maybe longer. No ID, no fingerprints in the system. Just a man in his late 30s, dead and frozen. They didn't find anyone else. No tracks, no signs of a break-in, no clear explanation. They said maybe the owner didn't know about the body. Maybe someone had broken in months ago, killed the man, and used the freezer to hide him. But that didn't explain the footprints, the scratches, the noises. I don't know who was out there. I don't know if they were watching me the whole time or just came back for something they left behind. All I know is I'll never go to a place that remote again. And every time I hear something at night now, some small sound I can't explain, I think about that footprint. Just one, standing still, facing me. City life had started to grind me down. I had a job I didn't care about, working late hours, staring at screens, eating bad food, sleeping too little, and waking up already tired. I lived alone, barely talked to anyone besides coworkers, and I was starting to feel like I was just dragging myself through the days. My body ached in ways it hadn't before. My head felt foggy more often than clear. I had a growing pressure in my chest that never seemed to go away. One day in early October, I decided I needed to get away from the noise. Not for a few hours, for a week or two. Just me, away from everything, no internet, no phone, no screens, no stress. I started looking at cabins online, and after a few hours of scrolling through pictures of scenic little places tucked deep in the woods, I found one that stood out. It was a small wooden cabin about 3 hours away from the city. No neighbors nearby. It sat close to a dried-out quarry, which had apparently been shut down years ago after flooding made it dangerous to keep working. The pictures showed a quiet place surrounded by trees with a porch out front, a wood-burning stove inside, and just enough modern touch, solar panels, battery-powered lights, a water tank, to be livable without too much hassle. It looked like the kind of place where time slowed down. The price was dirt cheap. I figured it was because of how isolated it was. I booked it for 9 days. I packed what I thought I'd need: dry food, instant coffee, plenty of water, clothes for the cold, a few basic tools, a sleeping bag, a flashlight with extra batteries, a hand crank radio, and a first aid kit. I threw everything in the back of my SUV and left early on a Saturday morning. I didn't even tell anyone where I was going, which, looking back now, was one of the biggest mistakes I've ever made. The drive out was long but peaceful. I played old music, rolled the windows down for fresh air, and stopped only once to grab gas and a sandwich. The further I drove, the more the roads narrowed and the fewer signs I saw. By the time I was within 30 minutes of the cabin, I didn't see another vehicle for miles. Just empty woods stretching out on both sides, and a narrow, cracking road that twisted like it had grown from the earth. Eventually, the GPS on my phone went out. I wasn't worried. I had the directions printed too, just in case. I turned onto a dirt path marked by a wooden post with a hand-painted cabin sign nailed to it. The tires crunched over gravel and dead leaves as I made my way down the slope. It was almost 3 p.m. when I arrived. The cabin looked just like the photos. Weathered wood, a small porch, 2 rocking chairs. The front steps creaked when I walked up, but everything felt solid. A tiny chimney rose from the roof. Trees stood thick around the clearing, blocking most of the sky except right above the cabin. To the side, a footpath led away, overgrown with weeds, and I figured it must go to the quarry. Inside, it was simple. 1 room, a small wood stove, a twin bed against the back wall, a tiny table with 2 chairs, shelves with cooking supplies, a locked cabinet labeled tools, and a small bathroom with a composting toilet. I opened the windows and let the cool air in. There was no bad smell. No signs of rats or bugs. It was better than I expected. I unpacked, made myself a quick cup of instant coffee using bottled water and a small camping stove, then stepped out onto the porch to drink it. The silence hit me harder than anything. No cars, no people, no buzzing lights, just the wind in the trees, a few bird calls, and the creaking of the cabin settling. That first night, I slept hard. I woke up a few times because of unfamiliar sounds. Branches cracking, something thumping softly outside, but I chalked it up to animals or wind. I had grown up in the suburbs. I wasn't used to how alive the woods felt at night. The next morning, I made oatmeal and decided to check out the quarry. I followed the narrow path that led from beside the cabin, pushing through undergrowth and swatting at gnats. After maybe 15 minutes of hiking downhill, the trees suddenly opened up. I stepped out into the edge of a massive pit. The old quarry. It was dry now, but the rock walls still looked wet in places, dark gray and rough. There were layers of stone cut down into the ground like massive steps. Piles of rubble and rusted metal sat around the edges. In the distance, a crane skeleton leaned sideways, long abandoned. The whole place felt like a forgotten wound carved into the earth. I stood there for a while, just looking at it. No animals moved nearby. No wind blew into the pit. It was like a dead zone, I suddenly felt exposed and turned back toward the cabin. That afternoon, I explored more of the surrounding woods. I didn't go far, just enough to get a feel for the area. Found some old beer cans in one spot, a torn tarp in another, probably from past campers or workers. I started a fire that night using the pit beside the porch, ate canned soup, and sat under the stars for hours. I felt good, peace, like I had finally escaped everything that had been wearing me down. But something changed the next day. It started with a sound early in the morning. I was still in bed, half awake, when I heard heavy footsteps outside. Not the quick skittering of an animal, slow, heavy steps, like boots on dirt. I sat up fast and grabbed my flashlight even though it was already getting light outside. The footsteps stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing. After maybe 5 minutes, I opened the door and stepped out. I didn't see anyone. No animals, no fresh tracks. Nothing. I told myself it was probably a deer or a bear, maybe something larger moving nearby. Still, the weight of those steps didn't feel right. That night, I locked the door, even though the area felt safe before. The next day, I found something that made my stomach sink. I had walked down toward the quarry again, wanting to explore some of the equipment left behind. The place had an eerie draw to it, like I needed to understand why it had been shut down. I walked along the rim, keeping an eye on where I stepped. That's when I saw it, a fresh boot print. Not mine. It was in soft dirt near one of the old machines. Deep, clear tread marks. I hadn't seen it the last time I was there. It hadn't rained, so it had to be recent. I stared at it for a long time. Then I saw another, and another. They circled the machine once, then led off toward the far side of the pit. I didn't follow them. My heart was beating fast, and something in me screamed to go back to the cabin. I didn't sleep much that night. Something scraped against the wall around 1 a.m. Not sharp, not fast, slow, dragging, like someone ran their hand or a stick across the logs. I lay still in my sleeping bag, holding my breath. I didn't dare move. After a few minutes, it stopped. The next morning, I saw long scratches on the side of the cabin, low to the ground. They weren't there before. Too low for a person's hand, too high for a rodent. I stood there staring at them for a long time. For long lines, uneven, like something clawed at the wall lazily. That day, I checked the path down to the quarry again and found a single plastic water bottle near the edge. Brand new, full, no label. I hadn't brought that kind. It wasn't mine. I felt watched. From that moment on, every time I stepped outside, I had the sense that someone was just behind the trees, barely out of sight. I didn't go exploring anymore. I stayed inside, kept the doors locked, listened for sounds. I started to hear snapping branches often. Sometimes I saw movement between the trees, but it was always quick. A shadow, a blur, gone before I could be sure. One morning, the axe I had been using to split firewood was missing. I had left it stuck in the chopping block like always. It was just gone. I checked everywhere. Nothing. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the corner of the room with the flashlight in my hand, the fire dead in the stove. I listened to every sound, heart pounding. Around 3 a.m., I heard something heavy land on the porch, then slow creaking steps. I held my breath so long it hurt. The steps moved across the boards, then stopped. Nothing happened for several minutes. Then knock, just once. A slow, deliberate knock on the door. Not loud, just a knock. I sat frozen. No second knock came. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I opened the door slowly. The rocking chair had been moved. It was facing the door directly now. The other chair was gone. I found it 20 feet into the woods, tipped over. That was it. I packed everything that morning. By 11 a.m., I had loaded the SUV, locked the cabin, and started driving. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I drove all the way back to the city in one shot, heart racing the entire time. Back home, I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I had been alone too long, sleep deprived, seeing things. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Something or someone else had been out there. I looked up the quarry later. I found one local news article from 8 years ago. It mentioned that after the flooding, some squatters had tried living in the abandoned equipment. Police cleared them out. One man had been It was the fall of 2021 when I decided to get away from everything for a few days. I'd been working nonstop since the start of the year, barely sleeping, and I could feel myself running out of steam. I needed space, quiet, and no emails. I found this old cabin listing online, cheap, off the grid, and tucked deep into the forest of northern Michigan. It looked rough, but that was what I wanted. No phone reception, no neighbors, just me and the woods. The drive there was long. After the last town, the roads turned into dirt paths, winding between tall trees, with no signs or other cars for miles. My GPS gave up about 40 minutes before I reached the place. I relied on a set of handwritten directions the owner had emailed me. I got there just before sunset. The cabin looked older than the pictures showed. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. The wood siding was worn and gray, the porch sagged in one corner, and the roof had patches of moss growing on it. Still, it looked sturdy enough. I parked my car beside the cabin and stepped out. It was quiet, dead quiet. No wind, no birds, nothing. I took my bags inside and looked around. It had one main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen space with an old propane stove, and a bedroom off to the side. There was no electricity, just oil lamps and a few candles. I unpacked, got the stove going for some heat, and made myself a quick meal from a can. That first night, I sat out on the porch with a flashlight and my jacket zipped up tight. The silence was overwhelming. You don't realize how much noise you live with until it's gone. There were no city sounds, no humming appliances, not even the rustling of leaves. Just black trees all around me and the sound of my own breathing. After a while, I started hearing little cracks and snaps in the woods. Probably animals. Still, I went inside and locked the door. The next day, I chopped wood from the pile beside the cabin, went for a walk around the area, and found an old path that looped down to a small creek. The water was clear and freezing. I filled a jug and brought it back. I didn't see any other people or signs of them. No wrappers, no tracks, nothing. I liked that. Felt like I was finally alone. That night, I woke up just past midnight. The fire in the stove had died down, and the cabin was cold. I got up to throw a log in and warm the place up. As I walked past the front window, I froze. I don't know why, but I just stopped and looked out into the dark. I didn't see anything at first, but something felt off. The trees looked the same. Nothing was moving. Then I noticed it. There was something on the porch railing. I couldn't see clearly through the glass, but it looked like a small pile of something. Maybe sticks? I got the flashlight and opened the front door. The air was sharp and cold. I stepped out onto the porch and there they were. A bunch of little wooden figures made from sticks and twine. 4 of them. They were shaped like people, kind of. Just 2 legs, arms, and a head. No faces. I picked one up. It was damp and smelled like dirt. It wasn't there the day before. I knew that. I would have noticed. I didn't know what to think. Maybe some local kids had snuck up and left them as a joke? But I hadn't seen a single house for miles on the way in. No lights, no tire tracks. I looked around with the flashlight, but the woods were still and empty. I left the figures on the porch and went back inside. The next morning, I found the figures arranged differently. One was now sitting on the porch steps. Another was hanging by a string from the porch light. I hadn't touched them. I started feeling a little on edge. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe animals knocked them over or I was remembering it wrong. I tried to enjoy the rest of the day. I took another walk and kept checking behind me. Nothing followed. But when I got back, I found footprints in the dirt. Barefoot human footprints. They came from the woods, circled the cabin, and disappeared back into the trees. I stood there staring at them for a long time. The prints were wide and deep, like someone heavy had walked through. They weren't mine. I had boots on all day and these were fresh. I followed them a little ways into the trees until they vanished into the underbrush. That night, I kept a fire going and stayed up, sitting in the chair by the door with a heavy flashlight in my lap. I didn't hear anything at first. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard a thump, like something heavy landing on the porch. I stood up slowly and looked out the window. I couldn't see anything. I unlocked the door quietly and opened it a crack. The stick figures were gone. Every last one of them. The railing was empty. I stepped outside, holding the flashlight out in front of me. I swept it back and forth across the clearing. Nothing. I stepped off the porch and walked around the cabin slowly. Nothing. Then I heard it. From the woods. A single snap like a twig breaking. Then another. Closer. I backed toward the cabin, heart pounding. I didn't see anything, but the feeling that something was watching me was so strong it made my skin crawl. I stayed inside the rest of the night. I didn't sleep, just sat there waiting. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the sun finally came up, I packed my things. I didn't care that I had planned to stay 2 more days. I just wanted out. I opened the door to start loading my car and stopped cold. On the porch were more footprints. These ones smaller, narrower. There were 2 sets. They circled around each other like someone had danced or paced in place. And in the center was one of the stick figures. Its arms were tied behind its back, and its legs were broken. Someone had placed a small stone over its chest. I didn't waste another second. I loaded my bags, locked the cabin, and drove out of there as fast as the dirt road would let me. My heart didn't stop racing until I hit the highway. I kept checking the rearview mirror the whole time. I didn't tell anyone about it right away. Not because I thought they wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't know what to say. I wasn't hurt. Nothing was stolen. But something was wrong out there. Something not right. Someone had been watching me. Someone had been walking around barefoot in the cold, moving things, leaving signs, and never letting me see them. And they wanted me to know they were there. I don't know if it was a warning or just a game. I don't even want to guess. All I know is that I'll never go back there. Not to that forest. Not to that cabin. Not even close. I still think about those figures sometimes. The way they were arranged. The footprints. The silence. Whatever was out there wanted to be seen, just not directly. And it made sure I left with that in my head. To this day, I still check outside my window before I go to bed. Just in case. Because you never know what might be standing out there in the dark, waiting, not making a sound. It was supposed to be a quiet break. I was burned out from everything. Work, city life, my phone constantly buzzing. I found a cabin listed on a small, local website. It wasn't on Airbnb or anything popular. It was in the middle of nowhere in northern Idaho, 2 hours from the nearest gas station. The pictures showed an old wooden cabin surrounded by trees, with a small stream running nearby and a clearing that let in just enough sunlight. It looked perfect, and honestly, the isolation was exactly what I wanted. I left early on a Wednesday morning. The drive was long but beautiful. Once I passed the last town, the road turned to gravel and twisted through thick woods. There were no signs after that, just a dirt path and the directions the owner had emailed me. It felt like I was entering a different world the deeper I went. Finally, after what felt like forever, I found the small clearing with the cabin. It looked just like the pictures, rustic, with a mossy roof and a small wooden porch. There was no cell signal, of course, but I had brought enough supplies for a week. The first day passed peacefully. I unpacked, checked the cabin from top to bottom, made a fire in the stove, and read a book on the porch while the sun dipped behind the trees. There was a calm out there that I hadn't felt in years. The quiet wasn't just about sound. It was like the air itself didn't want to rush. I slept early that night. The window cracked open just enough to hear the wind. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a thump outside. At first, I thought it was a branch or a raccoon. I stayed in bed, listening. Then I heard it again, a short, dull thud, like someone stomping once on the porch. I froze. The cabin was old. Sounds carried weirdly through the wood. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing else happened. After 10 minutes, I convinced myself it was probably just the wood settling or something falling from the roof. I fell asleep again, though I kept waking up every hour, checking the shadows outside the window. The next morning was cold and foggy. I found a few pine cones scattered on the porch and a squirrel's footprint in the dust. That calmed me a bit. I spent the day chopping wood and writing in a notebook. It felt good to unplug completely. I explored a bit down the stream, careful to mark trees with red tape so I wouldn't get lost. I didn't go far, maybe a half-mile downstream. I never saw another person, not even a plane overhead. The second night, I heard footsteps again. This time, they weren't just one or two. I counted 5 slow, deliberate steps across the porch. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The cabin didn't have blinds, just thin curtains. I didn't want to move or make a sound. I waited, ears straining. Then, nothing. No door creak. No retreating steps. Just silence. I finally got up and peeked outside. There was nothing. No one. I stood there a long time, feeling stupid, and then went back to bed, locking the door with the bolt. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt in front of the porch. They were faint but clear. They weren't mine. I had hiking boots. These were lighter, maybe work boots or something like that. They led from the trees to the porch, then back into the woods. I stared at them for a long time. I checked the perimeter. I even walked into the woods a bit, looking for other signs, but the tracks disappeared quickly in the undergrowth. I felt off the rest of the day. Not panicked, just watched. I tried to distract myself by staying busy, fishing in the stream, writing, whittling wood like I used to as a kid. But I couldn't stop thinking about the prints. That night, I moved a chair in front of the door. I made sure the axe I had used for chopping wood was next to my bed. At around 1:30 a.m., I heard the creak of wood again. The same slow footsteps. This time I was ready. I didn't make a sound. I held my breath and waited. The steps stopped at the door. I heard the faintest sound, like someone running their fingers across the wood. I sat up in the dark, staring at the door, heart racing. Then, after what felt like forever, nothing. No knock, no voice, no footsteps leaving. I waited until sunrise to sleep again. When I got up, I went outside and checked the porch. More footprints, same pattern. I circled the cabin this time and found something I hadn't noticed before. A small plastic wrapper tucked behind a tree. It looked new. Someone had been out there. Maybe someone camping illegally, or just screwing with me. But the nearest road was over 10 miles away. Why would anyone be out here? On the 4th night, I decided not to sleep. I stayed up with the fire burning and all the lamps on. I sat in the living room with the axe beside me. It was quiet until just after 2 a.m., and then I heard movement. Not just on the porch this time. This time it was at the back of the cabin, near the kitchen. I crept to the window and looked out, but saw nothing. Then the noise moved again, circling the cabin. It stopped at the front. I saw a shadow just beyond the edge of the trees, unmoving. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. After about a minute, it stepped back into the woods. Slowly, I waited until dawn again before relaxing. That morning, I hiked out toward the car. I didn't pack up, just locked the cabin and left. I was too shaken to stay another night. The hike back was long, and I was looking over my shoulder every 10 steps. When I got back to my car, it was untouched. I drove straight to the nearest town and checked into a small motel. I used their Wi-Fi to email the cabin owner. I told him someone might be lurking near the property. I didn't go into detail. He never responded. I checked again a week later. The listing was gone. A month passed. I got back to work, but I kept thinking about the cabin. I told a friend about it and he got curious. He did some digging and found an old article from 6 years ago. Apparently, a guy had gone missing near that area. His truck was found abandoned. No body, no gear, just gone. The woods were searched, but they never found him. The story made my skin crawl. I kept thinking about the footprints, about how quiet it all was, how whoever it was never tried to break in, never said a word, just watched, moved at night, like they were used to those woods, like they belonged there more than I did. I never went back. I never found out who it was. I tried to forget it, but I can still hear those steps in my head. Slow, careful, deliberate, like someone walking in a place they knew every inch of while I was just passing through. I don't go into deep woods alone anymore. I still camp, but only in known areas. places with people nearby. The silence out there isn't peaceful to me anymore. It's a warning, a reminder that just because you can't hear someone doesn't mean they aren't close. Just because a door stays closed doesn't mean someone isn't standing right outside of it. Some places are better left alone. Some cabins are better left empty, not because of ghosts or monsters, just because someone else might be out there, and they might not want to be found.